They are some of the most remarkable realms of Middle-earth, great domains of the fairest of Iluvatar's children. These kingdoms would witness and take part in some of the greatest events in the history of Arda, enduring from the beginning of the First Age to the end of the Third and beyond. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we take a compiled look at the kingdoms and realms of the Elves. First, we'll look at one of the first elven realms ever established, the Forest Kingdom of Doriath. The origins of Doriath date back to the elder days of Arda, not long after the elves' awakening at Cuivienen and their great journey west. On this journey, as the elves make their way across Beleriand, the Teleri Lord Elwë strayed from his group and wandered into the forest of Nan Elmoth. There he would meet one of the Maiar, Melian. The two would fall in love and become transfixed, caught in an enchantment of their own making. The two would remain trapped in this enchantment for several years, until finally, in the year of the trees 1152, Elwë and Melian would awaken and rejoin their people. By this point, a good portion of the Teleri had continued on to Valinor, following Elwë's brother, Olwë. The elves who remained would become known as the Sindar, or Grey Elves, and they would take Elwë as their lord, who would then become known as Elu Thingol. Thingol would establish a realm for his people near the river Sirion, encompassing the forests of Neldoreth, Nivrim, Region, Rathrim, Brethil, and Nen Elmoth. In time, Melian would counsel Thingol to build a stronghold for their people, for she foresaw that the current peace in Arda would not last. At this time, Thingol was on good terms with the dwarves of Belegost, and so commissioned them to help build the great fortress of Menegroth, the 1,000 Caves. This great city was hewn into the hills along the banks of the river Escalduin. For many years, Doriath would enjoy a period of peace, while Morgoth is imprisoned by the Valar. However, as Melian foresaw, it would not last. For in the year of the trees 1495, Morgoth would destroy the two trees and depart Valinor, returning to Middle-earth. He would swiftly launch an attack on the peoples of Beleriand, looking to establish his dominance early. In response, Thingol would lead a host from Menegroth to counter the onslaught. This battle, largely fought upon the plains to the east and west of Doriath, would ultimately be a victory for the elves, and the forces of Morgoth would be beaten back to Angband. While the elves are victorious, it is clear that the ongoing threat of Morgoth will be substantial. Therefore, Thingol would recall his people into the forests of Neldoreth and Region. Melian would then create an enchantment encircling the land. It creates an invisible wall of shadow and confusion, preventing anyone from entering the realm without her or Thingol's leave. It is known as the Girdle of Melian. Due to this enchantment, the realm of Thingol and Melian would come to be known as Doriath, Land of the Fence, or Land of the Girdle, and its people would be called the Lathrim, or People of the Fence. While Thingol's realm was now secure, he would be loath to cede any of his outlying lands to the Noldor, who had followed Feanor in pursuing Morgoth to Middle-earth. As we read in the Silmarillion, now King Thingol welcomed not with a full heart the coming of so many princes in might out of the west, eager for new realms, and he would not open his kingdom, nor remove its girdle of enchantment, for wise with the wisdom of Melian, he trusted not that the restraint of Morgoth would endure. Alone of the princes of the Noldor, those of Finarfin's house were suffered to pass within the confines of Doriath, for they could claim close kinship with King Thingol himself, since their mother, was Eärwen of Alqualonde, Olwe's daughter. Angrod, son of Finarfin, was the first of the exiles to come to Menegroth as messenger of his brother Finrod, and he spoke long with the king, telling him of the deeds of the Noldor in the north, and of their numbers, and of the ordering of their force. But being true and wise-hearted, and thinking all the griefs now forgiven, he spoke no word concerning the kinslaying, nor of the manner of the exile of the Noldor, and the oath of Feanor. King Thingol hearkened to the words of Angrod, and ere he went he said to him, "Thus shall you speak for me to those that sent you. In Hithlum the Noldor have leave to dwell, and in the highlands of Dorthonion, and in the lands east of Doriath, that are empty and wild. But elsewhere there are many of my people, and I would not have them restrained of their freedom, still less ousted from their homes. Beware, therefore, how you princes of the west bear yourselves, for I am the Lord of Beleriand, and all who seek to dwell there shall hear my word. Into Doriath none shall come to abide, but only such as I call as guests, who seek me in great need." And so the Noldor would settle in the surrounding lands outside of Thingol's realm. Yet there would be no great love between them. However, they would not exist in total isolation, for Finrod and his sister Galadriel would visit Doriath at the invitation of their kinsman Thingol. There, Thingol would counsel Finrod to settle in the caverns of Narog, a place soon to be known as Nargothrond. For her part, Galadriel would dwell with Melian, learning great lore and wisdom, and at times Melian and Galadriel would speak together of Valinor and the bliss of old. But beyond the dark hour of the death of the trees, Galadriel would not go, but ever fell silent. And on a time Melian said, "There is some woe that lies upon you and your kin, that I can see in you, but all else is hidden from me. For by no vision or thought can I perceive anything that passed or passes in the west. A shadow lies over all the land of Aman, and reaches far out over the sea. Why will you not tell me more? For that woe is past," said Galadriel, "and I would take what joy is here left, untroubled by memory, and maybe there is woe enough yet to come, though still hope may seem bright." Then Melian looked in her eyes and said, "I believe not that the Noldor came forth as messengers of the Valar, as was said at first, not though they came in the very hour of our need. For they speak never of the Valar, nor have their high lords brought any message to Thingol, whether from Manwë or Ulmo, or even from Olwe, the king's brother, and his own folk that went over the sea. For what cause, Galadriel, were the high people of the Noldor driven forth as exiles from Aman? Or what evil lies on the sons of Feanor, that they are so haughty and so fell? Do I not strike near the truth?" "Near," said Galadriel, "save that we were not driven forth, but came of our own will, and against that of the Valar, and through great peril, and in despite of the Valar, for this purpose we come, to take vengeance upon Morgoth, and regain what he stole." Then Galadriel spoke to Melian of the Silmarils, and of the slaying of King Finwë at Formenos, but still she said no word of the oath, nor the kinslaying, nor of the burning of the ships at Losgar. But Melian said, "Now much you tell me, and yet more I perceive. A darkness you would cast over the long road from Tirion, but I see evil there, which Thingol should learn for his guidance." "Maybe," said Galadriel, "but not of me." And so Melian would share with Thingol all that she had learned, and their fears would grow. At length, whispers would begin to spread throughout the Sindar of the deeds of the Noldor, finally reaching the ears of Círdan, In his wisdom, he perceived the danger in the words, whether true or false, and would send messengers to Thingol to convey all that he had heard. And it would chance that these messengers would arrive at a time when Finrod, along with his brothers Angrod and Agnor, were in Doriath visiting their sister. Then Thingol, being greatly moved, spoke in anger to Finrod, saying, "Ill have you done to me, kinsman, to conceal so great matters from me. For now I have learned of all the evil deeds of the Noldor." But Finrod answered, "What ill have I done you, lord? Or what evil deed have the Noldor done in all your realm to grieve you? Neither against your kingship, nor against any of your people have they thought evil or done evil." "I marvel at you, son of Eärwen," said Thingol, "that you would come to the board of your kinsmen thus red-handed from the slaying of your mother's kin, and yet say naught in defense, nor seek yet any pardon." Then Finrod was greatly troubled, but he was silent, for he could not defend himself, save by bringing charges against the other princes of the Noldor, and that he was loath to do before Thingol. But in Angrod's heart, the memory of the words of Caranthir welled up again in bitterness, and he cried, "Lord, I know not what lies you have heard, nor whence, but we came not red-handed. Guiltless we came forth, save maybe of folly, to listen to the words of fell Feanor, and become as if besotted with wine. And as briefly, no evil did we do on our road, but suffered ourselves great wrong, and forgave it. For this we are named talebearers to you, and treasonable to the Noldor, untruly as you now. For we have of our loyalty been silent before you, and thus earned your anger. But now these charges are no longer to be borne, and the truth you shall know." Then Angrod spoke bitterly against the sons of Feanor, telling of the blood at Alqualonde, and the doom of Mandos, and the burning of the ships at Losgar. And he cried, "Wherefore should we that endured the grinding ice bear the name of kinslayers and traitors?" "Yet the shadow of Mandos lies on you also," said Melian. But Thingol was long silent ere he spoke. "Go now," he said, "for my heart is hot within me. Later you may return if you will, for I will not shut my doors forever against you, my kindred, that were ensnared in an evil that you did not aid. With Fingolfin and his people also I will keep friendship, for they have bitterly atoned for such ill as they did. And in our hatred of the power that wrought all this woe, our griefs shall be lost. But hear my words. Never again in my ears shall be heard the tongue of those who slew my kin in Alqualonde, nor in all my realm shall it be openly spoken, while my power endures. All the Sindar shall hear my command, that they shall neither speak with the tongue of the Noldor, nor answer to it, and all such as use it shall be held slayers of kin and betrayers of kin unrepentant. And so the sons of Finarfin would depart in shame. In his anger, Thingol would ban the use of the Quenya language in his realm, and would refuse to aid the Noldor in their battles against Morgoth, though, in time, his anger with Finrod and his family would cool. Over the years of the First Age, the relative isolation of Doriath would begin to fade. When men first begin to arrive in Beleriand in the early years of the First Age, Thingol would deny them entry to Doriath. However, at Finrod's behest, and in recognition of their valor, Thingol would allow the Halidin, one of the three houses of the great men of the First Age, to settle in the forest of Brethil, under the condition that they guard the crossings of Teglin. Decades later, in 455, Morgoth would break the siege of Angband in the Battle of Sudden Flame. Finally unleashed after 400 years, his forces would spread throughout Beleriand, wreaking havoc and destruction throughout the land. Thingol would lead a force from Doriath to counter Morgoth's eastern army, and by 462, he would succeed in scattering the enemy forces, leading to the army's demise in the north by the sons of Feanor and the east by the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. The girdle would keep the realm of Doriath safe for many long years, preventing anyone from entering unbidden. However, Melian would foretell that one would come whose doom was greater even than her own power. And indeed, in 464, Beren, son of Barahir, would come to the realm of Doriath and enter unbidden. It is here that Beren would meet and fall in love with Luthien, daughter of Thingol. They would come to Menegroth, where, after receiving the scorn and disapproval of the king, Beren would accept the quest to retrieve a Silmaril. As we know, Beren and Luthien would succeed, and though the Silmaril would be eaten by a werewolf along with Beren's hand, the couple would return to Menegroth to the great wonder of the king. It is at this time that the girdle of Melian would be breached for a second time, for the great wolf Carcharoth, tormented by the Silmaril burning inside him, would enter the lands of Doriath, the power of the Silmaril and his own doom overwhelming the girdle. Thingol would lead a hunting party to find and kill the great beast, which they would eventually do in the forest of Neldoreth, though at the cost of both Beren and Huon's lives. In 473, Doriath would receive another visitor laden with a powerful doom, Turin, son of Hurin. He would come to the kingdom at the request of his mother. Taking pity on Hurin's family, Thingol would agree to foster Turin as his own son. Turin would grow to be a mighty man and would eventually receive leave of Thingol to join his friend Beleg Strongbow on the northern marches of Doriath, fighting against the orcs of Morgoth, where he would win great renown. However, his time in Doriath would not last long, for Turin would accidentally cause the death of the elf Cyaros, one of the king's counselors. Before facing judgment, Turin would flee, never to return. As we know, Turin's life would eventually come to a tragic end, yet his impact on Doriath would not end there. In 502 of the First Age, his father Hurin, recently released from Morgoth's captivity, would come to the guarded kingdom. There, in his anger and grief, he would rebuke the king and mockingly deliver to him the Nauglamir, the necklace of the dwarves. So great was Hurin's torment and anguish that Thingol was moved to pity rather than anger. Then Melian spoke to Hurin, piercing through his madness and grief, and the shadow is lifted from his sight. In shame and remorse, he then offers Thingol the Nauglamir in sincerity and departs the realm. Thingol now finds himself in possession of two of the greatest treasures of Arda, a Silmaril and the Nauglamir. A desire awakes within him to combine the two, and he would commission dwarven craftsmen to accomplish the feat. However, these dwarves lust after the Nauglamir, and upon receiving the scorn of Thingol, would grow angry and attack the king, killing him. And so, in 503, Elu Thingol, High King of the Sindarin Elves in Beleriand, would perish. The dwarves would be hunted down, and the Nauglamir returned to Menegroth. Unbeknownst to the elves, the death of Thingol would also mark the beginning of the end for the realm. For with Thingol slain, Melian in her grief would leave Middle-earth, and with her departure, so ended the girdle of Melian. That same year, dwarves from Nogrod would assault Doriath in retribution for the slaying of their kinsmen. With the protection of Melian gone, they would meet little resistance until reaching Menegroth, and there would commence the Battle in the Thousand Caves, where both elves and dwarves would suffer heavy losses. In the end, dwarves would prove victorious, destroying and plundering the fortress and taking the Nauglamir. However, elven messengers would escape and bring word to Beren and Luthien, who, with the help of the Green Elves and the Ents, would destroy the returning dwarves. thereby rescuing the Nauglamir. The rule of Doriath passes to Beren and Lúthien's son, Dior, who after his parents' death becomes the keeper of the only free Silmaril in Arda. The knowledge of this awakes the oath in Feanor's children, who swiftly send word to Dior demanding the Silmaril's return. Dior returns no answer, and so in the winter of 506, fueled by their oath, the sons of Feanor attack Doriath, thus committing their second kinslaying against their fellow elves. In this terrible conflict, 3 of the sons of Feanor, along with Dior and most of his family, would be slain. And by 507, the realm of Doriath is utterly destroyed. So ended the first great Sindarin kingdom in Middle-earth. Throughout its life, it would bear witness to some of the greatest tales of the First Age. While its downfall would be tragic, it would in time play its part in the eventual defeat of Morgoth and the ending of the First Age. For from the ruins of Doriath, the Silmaril would pass to Dior's surviving daughter, Elwing, and with her husband Eärendil, they would move the Valar to war. Next, we'll look quickly at one of the shorter-lived kingdoms of the Elves, the great stronghold of Nargothrond. Nargothrond's history began with the coming of the Noldor to Middle-earth. Finrod, brother of Galadriel, would settle in the north of Beleriand with his brothers and Fingolfin. In the 50th year of the First Age, Finrod would be visited by his cousin Turgon, and the two would travel south. One day, while resting in the Meres of Twilight, Ulmo would put the two into a deep sleep filled with disturbing dreams. Neither would tell the other of their dreams, but both would begin to search for hidden places in case Morgoth would break the siege of Angband. 2 years later, Finrod would stay with King Thingol in Doriath for a time. There, inspired by the halls of Menegroth, he would tell Thingol of his desire to create a stronghold of his own. Thingol would then tell Finrod of the caves under the High Foroth, on the west bank of the river Narog. Finrod would make his way to the caves, and, upon arriving, resolved to build a stronghold. However, this area was not uninhabited, for several of the petty dwarves lived in these caves. Finrod would commission them to build his great stronghold, rewarding them handsomely. Nargothrond would finally be completed in the year 102 of the First Age, and Finrod would hold a great feast to mark its completion. In 150, dwarves from the Blue Mountains, encouraged by their new alliance with Curufin, would come to Nargothrond and there help Finrod expand his halls. However, these dwarves would hold a hatred for the petty dwarves and would force them out of Nargothrond. This would infuriate the leader of the petty dwarves, Mim, who would hold a deep hatred of the elves forever after. He would even attempt to murder Finrod, but he would fail and would then be forced out into the wild. Finrod would rule Nargothrond for over 300 years, until one day he is visited by Beren, son of Barahir. He would tell Finrod of his quest to retrieve a Silmaril and present him with Barahir's ring. Finrod would depart Nargothrond to join Beren on his journey, never to return. The rule of Nargothrond passes to Orodreth, a rule that would be tragically short-lived. Not long after Finrod fell in the dungeons of Sauron, Turin Turambar would find his way to the Hidden Realm. He would quickly become one of Orodreth's counselors and gain influence throughout Nargothrond. He would advise the elves to end their practice of secrecy and openly fight against Morgoth. This leads to the construction of a great bridge from the stronghold's gates over the river. Turin's reputation spreads, as was not uncommon in his tale, and word would reach Morgoth. The Dark Lord sends the dragon Glaurung to attack Nargothrond, and the creature is successful in sacking the city after Orodreth's demise. Glaurung would stay in Nargothrond for close to 5 years before departing to pursue Tuorin, both ultimately meeting their ends. After the dragon's departure, Nargothrond would be settled by Mim the Petty Dwarf, reclaiming his ancient home. He would dwell there until Tuorin's father, Hurin, arrived. Hurin kills the treacherous dwarf. He then descends into the caves and finds the great treasure that Glaurung had amassed. Among the many wonders Finrod had brought from Valinor, Hurin would find the Nauglamir, the necklace of the dwarves. Hurin would then depart for Doriath, and with that, Nargothrond would remain totally abandoned until it would fall at last into the sea as part of the destruction of Beleriand after the War of Wrath, and so would end the kingdom of Nargothrond. Next, we round out the great First Age elven realms by looking at one of the mightiest and most secret domains, the kingdom of Gondolin. In the northern lands of Beleriand, there lay a round valley called Tumladen, which is surrounded by the Echoriad, or encircling mountains. In the earliest days of Arda, this valley was a great lake, but was emptied into the river Sirion, leaving behind a green plain. The passage from which the lake drained created what would be the only entrance into the valley, the secret path of Orfalk Ekor. This unique geological feature would go undiscovered for quite some time. Finally, in the year 53 of the First Age, the elf lord Turgon would discover Tumladen with the guidance of the Vala Ulmo, the Lord of Waters. 3 years prior, Ulmo had appeared to Turgon and his cousin Finrod separately in dreams, guiding them to found secret realms. Finrod would found the realm of Nargothrond. Upon seeing the valley of Tumladen and a great hill in its center, the hill of Amon-Gwareth, Turgon would plan the construction of his own hidden city. Turgon returns to his home in Nevrast to begin planning his city, though he would not move toward this goal until 11 years later. In the aftermath of the Dagor Agreleb, a battle where the elves defeat Morgoth, Turgon begins to feel an unquiet in his heart, and taking his most skilled craftsmen, he goes to the hidden valley and the construction begins. They build the city upon Amon-Gwareth in remembrance of the elven city of Tirion in Valinor, which was likewise built upon a hill. Turgon would mostly continue to dwell in Nevrast over the next 52 years as his city is constructed. The construction itself protected by companies of elves, but also the power of Ulmo. Finally, in 116 of the First Age, the city is completed, and Turgon gives it the name Ondolinde, meaning Rock of the Music of Water, in honor of its fountains. However, it is more commonly known by its Sindarin name, Gondolin, the Hidden Rock. Before he leaves Nevrast, Turgon is visited once more by Ulmo, who says, "Now thou shalt go at last to Gondolin, Turgon, and I will maintain my power in the Vale of Sirion, and in all the waters therein, so that none shall mark thy going, nor shall any find there the hidden entrance against thy will. Longest of all the realms of the Eldalie shall Gondolin stand against Melkor. But love not too well the work of thy hands, and the devices of thy heart, and remember that the true hope of the Noldor lieth in the west, and cometh from the sea. Thus it may come to pass that the curse of the Noldor shall find thee too ere the end, and treason awake within thy walls. Then they shall be in peril of fire, but if this peril draweth nigh indeed, then even from Nevrast one shall come to warn thee." Turgon's people would leave Nevrast and enter the valley secretly in separate companies, rather than as a large single group. Even after their arrival, the people of Gondolin would continue work on the city, until it was said to rival even Tirion itself in its greatness and beauty. It is known for its high white walls and the king's great tower. Within Turgon's court, there stood 2 trees made by the king himself. They are called Glingal and Belthil, and are made in the image and in remembrance of the 2 trees of Valinor. The elves would have a great friendship with the eagles of Manwë, who lived in the encircling mountains. Thanks to the siege of Angband, which came after the Dagor Agreleb, Gondolin was able to grow in peace for 200 years. However, in 316 of the First Age, Turgon's sister Arathel grew tired of her life within the valley and chose to leave the city against her brother's wishes. They would not hear of Arathel for over 80 years, causing the city to fall into a sorrow. Arathel, however, would return in the year 400 of the First Age. With her was her son, Meglin, for they had fled from his father, Eol the Dark Elf. Turgon welcomes them home to Gondolin, and Meglin is enamored with the city after his life in the small forest of Nan Elmoth. However, Eol would follow his wife and son to Gondolin, and, captured near the entrance, he is taken to the king. After Turgon explains that no visitor of Gondolin is allowed to leave, Eol refuses and claims to choose death for both himself and his son, as he throws a poisoned dart at Meglin. However, Arathel shields her son, and having been struck by the dart, she would fall ill from the poison and die. For this evil deed, Eol is taken to the top of the walls of the city, where he yells to Meglin, "Here may you yet die the same death as I." And with those final words, Eol is cast from the high wall to his death. For his part, Turgon welcomes his sister's son into his realm, where Meglin would grow to become a lord of Gondolin. But it is said that amid all the bliss of that realm, a dark seed of evil was sown. The siege of Angband, which had kept peace in the north of Beleriand for many long years, would be broken in 455 with the Battle of Sudden Flame. While Gondolin would not take part in any of the ensuing conflicts, these conflicts would set into motion Gondolin's future participation against the Dark Lord. As the men of Brethil come under attack by orcs in 458, the brothers Hurin and Huor are cut off from their people and become lost near the feet of the Chrysaegrim. Spotting the men, the Lord of the Great Eagles Thorondor rescues them and brings them to Gondolin. At the behest of Ulmo, Turgon would welcome them into the city, where they would live for nearly a year. Despite his proclamation that no one should leave, Turgon allows the brothers to do so after they swear to never reveal the location. While they are true to their word, other men were able to deduce that perhaps the brothers had indeed been in the hidden city. Thus, a rumor would eventually come to Morgoth's servants that the mortal brothers would indeed know the location of Gondolin. Gondolin receives a brief mention in the tale of Beren and Luthien, as 7 years after Hurin and Huor are allowed to leave, the Eagles would rescue Beren and Luthien after their quest of the Silmaril. As Beren is gravely wounded, Luthien sees far below a white light amidst a green jewel. However, she wept for her beloved, but it is said in song that her tears, falling from on high as she passed, came like silver raindrops on the plain, and there a fountain sprang to life, the fountain of Tenuviel, Aethel Ninui, most healing water. Thus, this great city known for its fountains would see a new fountain arise upon the plain of Tumladen, the fountain of Tenuviel, whose waters would have healing powers so long as it lasted. In 472, Gondolin would finally enter into the battles of Beleriand. While his brother, the High King Fingon, would ally with the sons of Feanor and others to make war upon Morgoth, Turgon would make his own preparations in secret. Unlooked for, Turgon arrives at the battle with 10,000 soldiers of the Gondolindrim. The battle would ultimately be a disaster for the Alliance, but thanks to the brothers Hurin and Huor and their people, the Elves of Gondolin would escape the battle. The only mannish survivor is Hurin, who is captured by Morgoth. The Dark Lord, having a great fear of Turgon, had a strong desire to discover and destroy Gondolin. However, despite his torment, Hurin would not reveal the location of the hidden city. After Meglin returns from the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, he constructs the Gate of Steel, the last of the 7 gates of Gondolin. These great gates were spaced along the entry road from the secret entrance to the city of Gondolin itself. The first is the Gate of Wood. placed at the end of the secret passage. The second gate in the ravine is the Gate of Stone, half a league from the Gate of Wood. It had 2 stone towers with a wall between. The third is the Gate of Bronze, which had 3 towers, was roofed, and clad in bright copper. It also featured many red lamps, which caused the copper and bronze to shine like fire. Its company of guards is larger than those preceding it, and they carried red-bladed axes while wearing mail which glowed like dull fire. The fourth gate is the Gate of Withrin Iron, which has 4 towers and spans the highest point of the canyon. Between the 2 middle towers was an image of Thranduil himself. The Gate of Silver is 5th, made of a wall of white marble with a silver door. Above the gate is an image of the white tree of Telperion, the silver of the 2 trees. Behind the gate was stationed 200 archers in silver mail and white-crested helms. The Gate of Gold is 6th, and last of Turgon's original gates. There are 6 orbs atop the wall, while in the center there is a pyramid with an image of Lorien, the golden of the 2 trees. Beyond its gate lay 300 archers in gilded mail bearing longbows. Finally, Meglin's Gate of Steel, which is like a great steel fence across the Orfalk Ekor. It has 7 needle-like pillars of steel, and between them are 7 crossbars of steel, with 49 vertical rods. High above the central pillar is an image of the helm of Turgon, who is now High King of the Noldor. Stationed at this final gate is a host of the army of Gondolin, with representatives of each of the guards of the 6 gates before it. With Morgoth's conquest of the north marching on, a warning would come to Turgon to avoid disaster for Gondolin. As he had promised, Ulmo sent a messenger with a warning to the king. Thus the man, Tuor, comes to Gondolin, wearing Turgon's own armor he had left behind in Vinyamar. However, in his pride and love of his city, Turgon ignores the warning. For his part, Turgon welcomes Tuor to live in his city, and Tuor would come to fall in love with and marry the king's daughter, Idril, and together they would have a son, Eärendil. Though he had ignored Ulmo's warning, Turgon did remember Ulmo's warning from centuries earlier and came to fear treason. He orders the 7 gates to be closed and forbids anyone from leaving the city. However, Morgoth's first clue as to Gondolin's location would come from outside the city. When the Dark Lord finally releases Hurin from captivity in 500 of the First Age, Hurin would eventually come to the encircling mountains the following year. With the Orfalk Ekor closed and rescue from Turgon denied him, Hurin cries out, "Turgon, Turgon, remember the fen of Serek. O Turgon, will you not hear in your hidden halls?" Thus, thanks to his spies watching Hurin, Morgoth learns the general area in which Gondolin lays. In the coming years, Turgon would learn of the falls of Nargothrond and Doriath from Thranduil, yet still he would not leave his city. Morgoth's servants would search for many years in vain for the city, thanks in large part to the protection of the eagles. Within the city itself, many of its residents went on not realizing the peril near them, save Idril, who felt dark forebodings upon her heart. In her wisdom, she orders the construction of a secret escape tunnel from the city. Only a few people were told about this, and Meglin was specifically not to be informed. For Meglin would greatly covet the heart of his cousin and harbor a hatred toward the man Tuor who had won it. In 509 of the First Age, disobeying his uncle's orders, he goes searching for ore outside the city and is captured by orcs and taken to Angband. Unlike Hurin before him, Meglin fears Morgoth's torment and agrees to betray Gondolin's location in exchange for Idril and lordship of the city. He leaves Angband freely and says nothing to his uncle, awaiting Morgoth's attack. The very next year, Morgoth is ready with both forces and knowledge, sending an army of Balrogs, orcs, wolves, and dragons to Gondolin's secret location. They cross the northern mountains and lay siege to the city. Turgon himself would fall in battle. The elf lord Ecthelion would fight Gothmog, the lord of Balrogs, and ensure their mutual destruction. And Meglin would attempt to kill the 7-year-old Eärendil and take Idril by force. However, Tuor intervenes, saving his family and causing Meglin to fall from the wall to his death, fulfilling the curse of his father. Tuor and Idril gather as many survivors as possible, taking them to Idril's secret path. Amidst their escape, they are ambushed by a company of orcs and a Balrog. While the great eagles attack the orcs, the elf lord Glorfindel fights the Balrog alone, so the refugees could make their escape. Like Ecthelion and Gothmog, Glorfindel and his enemy are both killed as they plunge into the abyss below. Thus falls the great city of Gondolin. Its great fountains, including the Fountain of Tenuviel, are destroyed in the ruin, and the greatest city of elves ever to be is no more. While Morgoth's long-coveted deed is complete, the escape of Eärendil would lead to his sailing to the west, convincing the Valar to intervene and bring about Morgoth's own downfall. While the wondrous city of Gondolin would lay in ruin and pass to legend, it would be remembered far into the Third Age, over 6,000 years after its fall. In 2941 of the Third Age, Thorin's company would discover 3 blades of Gondolin in a troll hoard. Among them, the dagger, later known as Sting, the sword Orcrist, and the sword of Torgon himself, Glamdring. The realm would be mentioned 3 times in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. At his council in Rivendell, Elrond tells of his father, Eärendil, who was born in the Great Realm. Gimli would sing the Song of Durin, telling of the ancient days of Khazad-dûm, which existed even in the days of Gondolin. And finally by Galadriel, as she tells of her time crossing into Eriador and fighting the Long Defeat. While many great realms of the elves would come both before and after, arguably none were so marvelous as the hidden city of Gondolin. In Tolkien's earlier writings, he laid out 12 houses of Gondolin, each with different symbols and actions during the fall. We'll cover those in a later video where we dive deep into the battle of the fall of Gondolin. We now look across the sea to the most blessed of dwelling places of the elves, Valinor. The continent of Aman comes about as a result of Melkor destroying the 2 lamps in the Valian year 3450. Retreating across the sea, the Valar would over the next 500 Valian years, which equate to 4,750 of our own years, settle and make safe the lands of Aman. During this time, they would raise the tallest mountains in the world alongside the eastern shore. These Pelori Mountains stand as a guard against Melkor. Upon Taniquetil, the highest peak, the Valar would place Ilmarin, the halls of Manwë and Varda, where they could look out across the earth. But it is behind their mountain range that the Valar would establish their great realm, Valinor. Upon the plains, they would establish the city of Valmar of Many Bells, where many of the Valar and Maiar would live. To the west of the city lies the greened mound of Azelohar. Then Nienna, Vala of Pity and Sorrow, watered the mound with her tears, and Yavanna, Vala of the Earth, began a song. And as they watched, upon the mound there came forth 2 slender shoots, and silence was all over the world in that hour, nor was there any other sound save the chanting of Yavanna. Under her song the saplings grew and became fair and tall, and came to flower. And thus there awoke in the world the 2 trees of Valinor. Of all things which Yavanna made, they have most renown, and about their fate all the tales of the elder days are woven. The 2 trees give light to all Valinor for all their days, the silver Telperion and golden Lorelin. They would each wax and wane in their turn, giving their own distinct light throughout the days of Aman. In Valinor, the Valar are able to create their idyllic land, a land with no stain upon flower or leaf, and no corruption or sickness in anything that lives. While Valimar would be a greatly important location for the Valar and Maiar, there are many other locations of great importance to each of the Valar. Primary among these is Mahanaxar, the Ring of Doom. This was the hall where the thrones of the Valar were set. But among the Valar, it was not only Manwë and Varda who would have their own dwellings outside Valimar. On the northern shores of Valinor, overlooking the encircling sea to the west of Aman, are the Halls of Mandos. Also known as the Halls of Awaiting, this is where the spirits of elves would go should their bodies be slain. There they would await re-embodiment. Mandos' sister, Nienna, would live in her halls further to the west, where her tears would flow as she looked out to the great sea. South of the Halls of Mandos were the Gardens of Lorien. Named for the Vala of Dreams and Visions, these gardens would be home to both him and his wife, Este, the healer of hurts. Yavanna would reside in great pastures in the south of Aman. Not far away to the northeast were the woods of Orome, where the great huntsman would often go tracking and hunting its many creatures. But it would not only be the great powers that would call Valinor home. Eventually, it would also be home to elves, the firstborn of Iluvatar. After their awakening far away in the eastern lands of Middle-earth, the Valar would intervene against Melkor for the elves' protection. The Dark Lord is captured and taken to the halls of Mandos and imprisoned. For no one, not even a mighty Vala like Melkor, could escape the Doomsman's halls once they entered. Around the Year of the Trees 1133, the first of the elves would be brought across the sea to Aman. At this time, the Valar would open the Kalakiria, a pass in the Pelori Mountains allowing the light of the two trees to reach this land immediately outside the mountain range. Here the elves establish Eldamar, the land of the elves in Aman. One of its main settlements is Tirion, upon the hill of Tuna, where the Noldor and Vanyar elves live. Another is Alqualonde, the seaside city of the shipbuilding Teleri elves. And the very island which the Valar used to ferry the elves to Aman itself would be permanently placed just off the coast. Upon this island of Tol Eressëa would lie the city, seaport, and haven of Avalone, the easternmost settlement of the elves of the uttermost west. For many years, the elves Valar and Maiar would live in peace in this beautiful realm, a land of bliss, lit by the wondrous light of the two trees. However, in the Year of the Trees 1400, Melkor begs for pardon, and it is granted, though he is restricted to dwell in the lands of Valinor. With his newfound freedom, Melkor befriends the Noldor and subtly begins to sow discord among them, most notably in the heart of Feanor, greatest craftsman of all the elves and maker of the Silmarils. And despite war never having come to the Undying Lands, Melkor instructs the Noldor in the making of armor and weapons. Among the lies Melkor feeds to Feanor are that the Valar are ill-pleased, that his Silmarils are not in their own possession, and that his half-brother Fingolfin seeks to usurp his father Finwë's leadership among their people. In the Year of the Trees 1490, this manifests when Feanor threatens his half-brother Fingolfin, drawing a sword upon him. For this action, Feanor is banished from Tirion by the Valar. Feanor and his sons go north and establish the stronghold of Formenos. Finwë also goes to Formenos out of love for his son. For a time, Melkor was not to be seen in Valinor, and no one would hear any word of him. And it is said that the light of the two trees was dimmed, and the shadows of all standing things grew longer and darker in that time. 2 years of the trees later, in 1492, Melkor comes to Formenos. There he attempts to manipulate Feanor. "Behold the truth of all that I have spoken, and how thou art banished unjustly. But if the heart of Feanor is yet free and bold, as were his words in Tirion, then I will aid him, and bring him far from this narrow land. For am I not Vala also? Yea, and more than those who sit in pride in Valimar. And I have ever been a friend to the Noldor, most skilled and most valiant of the people of Arda. Now Feanor's heart was still bitter at his humiliation before Mandos, and he looked at Melkor in silence, pondering if indeed he might yet trust him so far as to aid him in his flight. And Melkor, seeing that Feanor wavered, and knowing that the Silmarils held his heart in thrall, said at the last, "Here is a strong place and well guarded, but think not that the Silmarils will lie safe in any treasury within the realm of the Valar." But his cunning overreached his aim. His words touched too deep, and awoke a fire more fierce than he designed. And Feanor looked upon Melkor with eyes that burned through his fair semblance, and pierced the cloaks of his mind, perceiving there his fierce lust for the Silmarils. Then hate overcame Feanor's fear, and he cursed Melkor and bade him gone, saying, "Get thee gone from my gate, thou jail crow of Mandos." And he shut the doors of his house in the face of the mightiest of all the dwellers in Ea. With this setback in his plans to obtain the Silmarils, Melkor flees to the far south of Aman. There, in the lands of Avathar, he encounters a great and powerful spirit, which takes the form of the greatest spider to ever exist, Ungoliant, the Gloomweaver. Abandoning his fair form, Melkor once again appears as a dark lord, tall and terrible, and he pledges to Ungoliant in return for her service, "Do as I bid, and if thou hunger still when all is done, then I will give thee whatsoever thy lust may demand. Yea, with both hands." Lightly he made this vow, as he ever did, and he laughed in his heart. Thus did the great thief set his lure for the lesser. Ungoliant weaves a web of darkness about them, and these two great and terrible beings make their way toward Valinor, first coming to the summit of Hyarmentir. Then descending and traveling north, they would make their way at last to the two trees. And even as Feanor and Fingolfin were reconciling during a great festival made by the Valar, Melkor strikes the two trees to their cores with his spear, and their sap pours forth as if it were blood, and was spilled upon the ground. Ungoliant drinks the sap until they are drained, and drinks dry the wells of Varda, the pools at their base which caught the dew of the two trees. As Valinor is plunged into darkness, Melkor makes his way to Formenos. There he kills Finwë and steals the Silmarils. Melkor and Ungoliant flee to Middle-earth, where the spider, now grown to an enormous size, wishes to consume the Silmarils to feed her lust. Melkor is barely saved by his Balrogs and takes the Silmarils to his fortress of Angband. Meanwhile, in Valinor, Feanor learns of the theft of the Silmarils, and while Melkor had been revealed as a traitor, his whispers to Feanor and his people years before would bear fruit. Feanor curses the Valar and their supposed desire to keep them from ruling their own lands in Middle-earth. He and his son swear a terrible oath to reclaim the Silmarils from anyone, friend or foe, and he names Melkor Morgoth, meaning Dark Tyrant or the Black Foe. Initially, nearly all of the Noldor would follow Feanor. They leave in groups, the first of which is led by Feanor himself. The last is led by Fingolfin and his youngest brother, Finarfin. Feanor leads his people to the shores of Aman and the port of Alqualonde. There he demands the Teleri to give the Noldor their ships, so that they may pursue Morgoth. The Teleri refuse, wishing to stop their friends from making a rash mistake and going against the word of the Valar. In his wrath, Feanor and his people attack the Teleri, and what follows is the first kinslaying of elves against elves, and after Morgoth's murder of Finwë, the second bloodshed in Valinor. Coming late to the battle, Fingolfin and Finarfin would only later learn of what had transpired. As the entire group of the Noldor makes its way up the coast, Mandos appears, pronouncing the doom of the Noldor. Ye have spilled the blood of your kindred unrighteously, and have stained the land of Aman. For blood ye shall render blood, and beyond Aman ye shall dwell in death's shadow. For though Eru appointed you to die not in Ea, and no sickness may assail you, yet slain ye may be, and slain ye shall be, by weapon and by torment and by grief, and your houseless spirits shall come then to Mandos. There long shall ye abide and yearn for your bodies, and find little pity, though all whom ye have slain should entreat for you. And those that endure in Middle-earth and come not to Mandos shall grow weary of the world as with a great burden, and shall wane and become as shadows of regret before the younger race that cometh after. The Valar have spoken. While Feanor and a great many of the Noldor would go on by boat or by the dangerous crossing of the frozen Helcaraxe in the far north to Middle-earth, Finarfin and a small group of his people would forsake the march, and returning to Valinor they would receive the pardon of the Valar. And while his brother Fingolfin and his sons and his daughter Galadriel would take the route of the Helcaraxe, Finarfin would be made leader of the Noldor who remained in Valinor, a mere 10% of their total number. Finally, in the 1500th year of the trees, the Valar would create the sun and the moon to give light to all the world of Arda. These are made from the last fruit and flower of the two trees, brought forth by the song of Yavanna and the tears of Nienna. After Morgoth's failed attack upon the Maya guiding the moon, the Valar would make moves to defend Valinor. Not only would they hide it from the mortal lands with mists and shadows, but they would raise the Pelori Mountains to sheer and dreadful heights. And so Valinor would remain closed to all for hundreds of years, as the elves and men of Middle-earth would struggle against Morgoth. As the Dark Lord's grasp upon Beleriand becomes stronger, there would be multiple attempts by the elves to sail to Valinor, to ask for the aid of the Valar. One is the doomed voyage of 495 of the First Age, where Varanwe is the sole survivor of his people, who washes ashore at Nevrast, where he meets Tuor. It would later be Tuor himself, after the fall of Gondolin, who attempts his own voyage to the Undying Lands. In 525, he and his wife Idril depart for Valinor, and according to the elves and men, it was told that they would arrive in the uttermost west. The next to sail for the shores of Aman is Tuor and Idril's son, Eärendil. Having escaped the third kinslaying with a Silmaril, Eärendil's wife Elwing joins him in his voyage. Eärendil would successfully navigate to the lands of Aman, and he would make his way inland to the elven city. But Eärendil climbed the green hill of Tuna and found it bare, and he entered into the streets of Tirion, and they were empty. And his heart was heavy, for he feared that some evil had come even to the Blessed Realm. He walked in the deserted ways of Tirion, and the dust upon his raiment and his shoes was a dust of diamonds, and he shone and glistened as he climbed the long white stairs. And he called aloud in many tongues, both of elves and men, but there were none to answer him. Therefore he turned back at last towards the sea. But even as he took the shoreward road, one stood upon the hill and called to him in a great voice, crying, "Hail Eärendil, of mariners most renowned, the looked for that cometh at unawares, the longed for that cometh beyond hope. Hail Eärendil, bearer of light before the sun and moon, splendor of the children of the earth, Star in the darkness, jewel in the sunset, radiant in the morning. The Valar, moved by Eärendil's plea for aid, prepare a mighty host to wage war upon Morgoth. Among these are Maiar, like Manwë's herald Eonwë, as well as the Vanyar elves. While much of the story of the elves in Valinor revolves around the Noldor, the Vanyar likewise lived in Valinor since those early days, though they had remained skeptical of Melkor after his release, and only one of their number would leave with the Noldor. Thus, for the first time since their coming to Aman, the Vanyar would travel to Middle-earth. With them is none other than Finarfin, leading his group of Noldor. As we've covered elsewhere, this War of Wrath results in the defeat of Morgoth, and the Valar cast him through the Door of Night, a mysterious passageway in the far west leading to the Void. Ever after, the Silmaril upon Eärendil's brow could be seen by those in Middle-earth as a great star as he sailed the sky. It is said that in or near Aman, Elwing's tower was built for her upon the borders of the outer world, in the northern regions of the Sundering Seas, from which she could fly to meet Eärendil in his journeys in the sky. Soon after the War of Wrath, the Valar raise out of the Great Sea an island as a reward for the men who fought alongside the elves against Morgoth, the island of Númenor. Fearing that these great mariners would be tempted to enter Aman, they forbade them from sailing out of eyesight of their own western coastline. Over centuries and millennia, the Númenorians would gradually fall to darkness, culminating with the rise of Ar-Pharazôn the Golden. Despite warnings from the Valar, Pharazôn would lead a great armament of many ships in 3319, sailing toward Valinor. Taking in the lies of Sauron, Pharazôn believes the mortal Númenorians could take immortality by force were they to come to Valinor. The great fleet encircles all the Isle of Tol Eressëa. Then landing upon the shores of Valinor, Ar-Pharazôn wavered and almost turned back. His heart misgave him when he looked upon the soundless shores and saw Taniquetil shining, whiter than snow, colder than death, silent, immutable, terrible as the shadow of the light of Ilúvatar. But pride was now his master, and at last he left his ship and strode upon the shore, claiming the land for his own, if none should do battle for it. The Númenorian host camps about the hill of Tuna, and Manwë calls upon Ilúvatar to intervene. Ilúvatar in that moment changes the very fashion of the world. A chasm opens between Númenor and Valinor, and all the fleet is drowned in the Great Sea. Pharazôn and his people that had set foot on the land of Aman were buried under falling hills, and it is said that there they remain, imprisoned in the caves of the Forgotten, until the last battle, the Dagor-Dagorath. Not only would Pharazôn's fleet be lost, but so too would the entire realm of Númenor, overtaken by the sea. In his great changing of the world, Ilúvatar makes Arda from a flat planet to a round one, and the lands of Aman, including Valinor and Tol Eressëa, are no longer part of the physical world. From this moment on, the Undying Lands could only be found by the Elves, who were given this special grace of the Valar to travel the straight road via their ships. Over time, countless elves would take the journey to Valinor, for Mandos's prophecy, spoken thousands of years prior, would indeed come true, and the elves would grow weary of the world. Of course, there would be others who would also sail to the uttermost west. The first of these are Bilbo and Frodo Baggins, in 3021 of the Third Age, granted this special privilege as bearers of the One Ring. Over 60 years later, Samwise Gamgee would become the third, sailing west after his wife Rosie's death. These mortals would live out their remaining days in peace on the Isle of Tol Eressëa. The last such mortal to come to the immortal lands of Valinor is also the one and only dwarf to do so. In the 120th year of the Fourth Age, nearly 60 years after Sam's voyage, Gimli would accompany Legolas when he makes his journey on the Straight Road. While the mortals would live and die after their years of peace in the West, there would yet be an immortal battle to be fought, the Dagor-Dagorath, which we've covered thoroughly in its own video. But it is said that in this time of the last battle, Eonwë will fight with Morgoth upon the plains of Valinor, and that it will be Turin Turambar with his black sword who will finally slay Morgoth. Then the Silmarils shall be recovered from their resting places of sea and air and earth. Then they will be broken, and as the world is remade, the two trees should be rekindled, and their great light come forth once again. No exploration of the Blessed Realm would be complete without exploring more deeply the mighty Isle of Tol Eressëa. This island was originally located in the middle of the sea, between the lands of Valinor and the lands of Middle-earth. It is said to be a remnant of the destruction of the Two Lamps, a lone isle in the vast sea. But this unassuming island would become vitally important after the awakening of the Elves. For as the Valar would invite the Elves to live in Valinor, there arose the question of how to get so many across the sea safely. To this point in history, the only beings making this trip had been Valar and Maiar. These higher beings, when unbound to a mortal form like the later wizards, would likely have no need of something that had not yet been mentioned: ships. The Silmarillion tells us, "Therefore Ulmo uprooted an island, which long had stood alone amid the sea, far from either shore, since the tumults of the fall of Iluin, and with the aid of his servants he moved it, as it were a mighty ship, and anchored it in the bay of Balar, into which Sirion poured his water. Then the Vanyar and the Noldor embarked upon that isle, and were drawn over the sea, and came at last to the long shores beneath the mountains of Aman, and they entered Valinor and were welcomed to its bliss." Due to the island being anchored in the Bay of Balar off the coast of Beleriand, part of it breaks off when Ulmo moves to take the Elves to Valinor. This results in the small Isle of Balar being left behind, and it was said that Ossë, one of the Maiar in the service of Ulmo, would often visit this smaller isle. While the Vanyar and Noldor elves would take this passage, their kin, and third of the 3 clans of their kind, would be left behind. Having missed the earlier summons of Ulmo, the Teleri had been split. Some remained in East Beleriand, searching for Thingol, who had gone missing. Others moved to the coast to the west, taking Olwe, Thingol's brother, as their king, and living near the mouths of Sirion. In the coming years, the Maiar Ossë and Uinen would come to the Elves and teach them sea lore and sea music, leading to the Teleri being not only the greatest singers of the Elves, but eventually the greatest seafarers. Back in Valinor, Finwë, Lord of the Noldor, would ask Ulmo to make a return trip with his floating isle, for he was great friends with the Teleri and wished them to join the Elves of Valinor. Thus Ulmo would bring the island back to the shores of Beleriand, and while some would remain in Middle-earth with Círdan, others would make the great journey west. They ride aboard the island across the sea, with Ossë following them on their voyage. But as the island comes to the Bay of Eldamar, the Elves hear the call of Ossë and wish Ulmo to stop rather than continue all the way to the land of Valinor. Ulmo consents and permanently roots the island within the bay, allowing the Teleri to live surrounded by the sea. There they would abide as they wished under the stars of heaven, yet within the sight of Aman and the deathless shore. While they had indeed come to the uttermost west, the Teleri did not enter Valinor, wishing to stay upon their island home, afterward called Tol Eressëa, the Lonely Island. Remaining detached from the Noldor and Vanyar, the Teleri would develop their own language, known as Telerin. It is said the Valar wished to see the Lonely Isle, and so made a gap within the Pelori Mountains. This gap would be called the Calakiria, meaning light cleft. This would have a great impact upon the island, as the light from Valinor would cause its lands to have fertile growth, and the waters surrounding it would shine with the gold and silver light of the two trees. And it is said that upon this isle, the first flowers east of the Pelori would grow. There would also be a great tree that would grow on Tol Eressëa. For in the elven city of Tirion, there was Galathylion, a tree made in the image of Telperion, the silver of the two trees. A seedling of Galathylion was given to the Teleri, who would name it Celeborn, meaning tree of silver. As the years go on, the Teleri are torn between their love of the sea and their desire to see their kin and the light of Valinor. In order to allow them to travel the seas, Ulmo sends Osse to the Teleri, who teaches them the craft of shipbuilding. But rather than sail them by wind, Osse gives them many strong-winged swans, who would draw their ships over the windless sea. Thus the Teleri would be split once again, with some remaining on Tol Eressëa. The Teleri would establish the port city of Alqualonde on the shores of Aman, and would fashion great ships in the shape of swans. Thus, swans would become a great motif among the elves, from those that pulled their first ships all the way to the boats found in Lorien. The next we would hear of Tol Eressëa comes as the First Age wanes. When Eärendil and Elwing make their great voyage to Valinor, requesting the aid of the Valar, they would pass Tol Eressëa on the way, and after the resulting War of Wrath, which would bring about the downfall of Morgoth, the elves who had left Valinor were forgiven by the Valar, and would come to dwell upon Tol Eressëa, and from there, some would go further to Valinor. Those that remained would live upon the isle, and within its chief city of Avalone, and it is said that the tower of this city would be the first sight a sailor would see when journeying to the Undying Lands. But Tol Eressëa would not be the only great island in the sea, for at the dawn of the Second Age, Osse would raise Numenor from the sea, a gift from the Valar to the men of the First Age. It is said that from Numenor, the men could see Tol Eressëa, and indeed these two islands would have close friendship. While the men were forbidden to sail to the Undying Lands, the elves of Eressëa would frequently visit Numenor. Even before men had discovered their new home, the elves would bring animals, flowers, herbs, and fountains from their own island to this land of gift. Perhaps greatest of all these gifts was Nimloth, a seedling of Celeborn. This white tree would be the ancestor of the white trees of Gondor, tracing a great lineage from the earliest days of the world to the latest. Unfortunately, the great friendship between elves and men would sour, for the Númenóreans would grow jealous of the elves' immortality. In turn, around 2,000 years into Númenor's existence, the Valar would send the elves of Tol Eressëa as messengers to the men, attempting to reason with them, explaining that their fates were separate. But most of the men would not listen, they would hear nothing of the separate and meaningful lives of their races. Instead, the sight of Avalone in the distance would only feed their resentment of the elves. Further into darkness, Numenor would fall, and during the raid of Ar-Gimilzor, any who welcomed the elven ships were punished, and the use of the elven tongue was forbidden. From this time onward, the elven ships would never again visit from Tol Eressëa, and soon after, the city of Avalone is veiled in cloud, hidden from Númenórean sight. Instead, the men would come to the Undying Lands. Led by their last king, Ar-Pharazôn, a great Númenórean fleet would make their way to Aman. From their city of Avalone, the elves would see this great fleet encompass their entire isle, and they would mourn, for the light of the setting sun was cut off by the cloud of the Númenóreans. In response to this act of war, Ilúvatar would open a great chasm in the sea, sinking the Númenórean fleet. And as the Isle of Númenor is swallowed miles away, Tol Eressëa, along with all of Aman, is set beyond the now sphere-shaped world, forever beyond the reach of mortal men. From this point onward, Tol Eressëa, along with Aman, is only reachable by the Straight Road, a mysterious path where elves leaving Middle-earth by ship could pass beyond the world itself, and yet becoming a destination or a temporary stop for elves would not be the end of the tale of this great island, for there would indeed be mortals who would come to its shores. In their own time, Bilbo, Frodo, Samwise, and Gimli would all make their way to the uttermost west, being granted special permission to take the road where no other mortals were permitted. While now living in the immortal lands, their nature as mortal beings is unchanged, and in time their lives would come to an end. And yet the days of their twilight were a reward. As Tolkien would tell us of Frodo in particular, he would enjoy a period of reflection and peace, and a gaining of a truer understanding of his position in littleness and in greatness, spent still in time amid the natural beauty of Arda unmarred. We now return to the lands of Middle-earth to explore some of the realms we are more familiar with. We begin with the remnants of Beleriand on the western coast of Middle-earth, the Kingdom of Lindon. While the realm of Lindon is mostly associated with the Second Age, the seeds of this realm were sown in the First. For the western lands of Lindon are the only mainland portion of Beleriand that was not destroyed in the War of Wrath. After this cataclysmic battle, the elves would build a haven in the gulf that was formed when Beleriand sank into the sea. And over the following 6,000 plus years, countless elves would sail from the Grey Havens to the uttermost west. Yet in this first year of the Second Age, most elves that survived the First Age wars did not wish to abandon the lands they had fought to defend. Thus they would establish a new realm of the elves. They name it after the First Age land of Osiriand, whose lesser used name was Lindon. As for their leadership, they would turn to the last heir of the kings of the Noldor, Gil-galad. While in the Silmarillion he is said to be the son of Fingon, Christopher Tolkien would later state in The Peoples of Middle-earth that he should have listed him as the son of Orodreth. But it would not only be elves that could at times be found in Lindon, for in 600 of the Second Age, the elves would receive visitors from a group of men they had not seen since their earliest days in these lands, the Edain of old, who are now known as Númenóreans. It's entirely possible that it was at the Grey Havens that the ancestors of these men sailed to discover their new land, nearly 600 years prior, and this is possibly where Elrond and his brother Elros would have parted as elf and mortal man. Gil-galad would welcome this great race of men on what would be the first of many visits of the Númenóreans to Middle-earth. In 725 of the Second Age, 125 years after their first voyage to Middle-earth, the Númenóreans would visit Lindon once again. This time, one of the sailors is Aldarion, son of King Tar-Meneldur. He would become friends with both Gil-galad and Círdan, and he would make frequent visits to the shores of Middle-earth. At the conclusion of one such journey in 882, Gil-galad would give Aldarion a letter for his father, warning him that a new shadow had arisen in the east, noting weaknesses in the defense of Eriador, and asking for Númenórean aid in facing this threat. Over the early centuries of the Second Age, many of the Teleri elves would actually leave Lindon, going to live with the Sylvan elves of Greenwood and Lorinund. Among them is Thranduil's father, Orofer, who would become king of the Woodland Realm. There would also be a migration for others among the Noldor, Sindar, and Green elves, who would follow Galadriel and Celeborn into Eriador. In 750 of the Second Age, some of these Noldor would follow Celebrimbor as he goes near the dwarves of the Misty Mountains to establish a new realm, Eregion. The elves of Middle-earth would grow their kingdoms over the coming years, gaining the attention of the great enemy remaining in Middle-earth. Around 1200 of the Second Age, Sauron would put on the fair visage of Anatar, and while he found men easiest to sway, he sought to persuade the elves to his service, for he knew the firstborn children of Ilúvatar had greater power. Thus, Anatar seeks entry into Lindon, but is denied, for Gil-galad and Elrond doubted him. Though he seemed fair, and they did not know who he truly was, they refused to admit him into their realm. While the elves of Lindon would not fall prey to Sauron's plans, those in Eregion would. Together with Anatar, Celebrimbor and the Smiths of Eregion would create 16 rings of power over the course of hundreds of years. As Sauron goes back to Mordor to forge his one ring, Celebrimbor makes 3 more rings, the Rings of the Elves. As Sauron's deception is discovered, Celebrimbor sends the 3 rings away, one to Galadriel in Lothlorien, and the other 2 come to Lindon, given to Gil-galad for safekeeping. Gil-galad would in turn entrust Narya, the Ring of Fire, to Círdan, while holding Vilya, the Ring of Air, himself. With Eregion coming under attack by Sauron's armies from Mordor, Gil-galad would send Elrond with a force of elves to their aid. Unfortunately, Eregion would fall in 1697, and Elrond would lead the survivors of the city north, where he would found Rivendell. Sauron's victory would open up to him the lands of Eriador, and over the next 2 years, Sauron's orcs would overrun the region. While Rivendell is under siege, Lindon faces its own challenges as well. Gil-galad and his people would barely hold the line at the River Lune. It would seem the elves were facing a losing battle, and it was only a matter of time until they would all fall to Sauron's superior forces. However, in this most desperate time, a fleet would arrive at the Grey Havens. Númenor had come. This fleet had been sent by Tar-Minastir, the heir of Queen Tar-Telperion, the great-great-granddaughter of Tar-Aldarion. Sauron suffers heavy losses and is forced to retreat southeast. Making a stand at Sarn Ford, he is defeated once again. Though he is reinforced, the elves and men would defeat him once again in the Battle of Gwathlo, thanks to a second force of Númenor sent in secret to Lon Daer. With Sauron defeated for a time, the wise of Middle-earth would meet to discuss what had transpired and what moves to make going forward. This group, made of wise men and elves of the age, would decide Imladris would be maintained as a stronghold in eastern Eriador, replacing Eregion. In secret, Gil-galad gives to Elrond the elven ring, Vilya, and after this loss, Sauron would forever harbor a hatred of the men of Numenor. Over the coming centuries, Sauron would take hold of the lands of the east and south, and even some of the westlands, known as the Dark Years, where the orcs would greatly multiply and the enemy's tyranny would reign. Lindon would see many flee to their lands. As the elves are hunted by the Dark Lord, they seek the safety of Gil-galad's realm, which remained beyond Sauron's reach. These days of flight saw many elves take refuge in Lindon, and some would finally abandon Middle-earth, sailing from the Grey Havens to Valinor. Sauron's power would only grow for many long years, yet so would the power of Numenor. And in 3262 of the Second Age, its 25th king, Ar-Pharazôn, would launch an invasion of Sauron's lands. After his own followers abandoned him, Sauron would surrender to Pharazôn and go back to Numenor as a prisoner. This development is a gift to the people of the Westlands, as they are finally left in relative peace. Gil-galad, as a result, is able to extend his power and influence. It is said that he would not only control most of Eriador, but all the way to the borders of Greenwood. However, this would all end some 57 years later. The first indication of evil deeds would have likely come to Lindon in the form of the sea itself, for the waters would ride in upon the land, covering some of the coastlands of Lindon, never to be seen again. The cause of this displacement of the sea is the sinking of the entire island of Numenor. Lindon would not only lose some of its land, but Sauron's return to Middle-earth would bring yet another rise of the Dark Lord. Still, their great allies of old were not wholly destroyed. Elendil would lead a group of 4 ships fleeing the downfall. They would travel to the Gulf of Lune and up the Lune River. There, Elendil would meet and befriend High King Gil-galad. While the threat of Sauron would rise in time, so would a new ally kingdom, Arnor. Elendil's realm, along with his son's kingdom of Gondor in the south, would be pivotal in the battles to come. As a gift to Elendil, Gil-galad would construct 3 tall towers in the Emin Bered. Within one of the towers, Elendil would store one of the Palantiri, the Seeing Stones rescued from Numenor. 110 years after the fall of Numenor, Sauron would finally move against the Free Peoples once more. He moves against Isildur and Anarion's realm of Gondor, launching an attack upon Minas Ithil. Isildur would flee, sailing to the north to bring word to his father. Hearing the news, Elendil and Gil-galad would meet at the watchtower of Aman-Sul and form the last alliance of elves and men. As we've discussed in other videos, this great alliance would go on to Rivendell, where they would plan their attack upon Mordor. Finally, in 3441, Gil-galad and Elendil would come face to face with Sauron himself. At the cost of their own lives, they would throw down Sauron's physical form, giving Isildur the chance to take his ring. Gil-galad was said to have been killed by the heat of Sauron's fiery hand, and so passes the High King and ruler of Lindon. After Sauron's defeat and the fall of their High King, the realm of Lindon would dwindle. Not only were some of the Noldor lost during the war, but many of these elves would finally decide to leave Middle-earth and take the voyage into the west. While technically next in line to do so, Elrond would not take the title of High King of the Noldor, though he would remain a great leader in Eriador. As for Lindon, It would be ruled from this time on by Círdan, who would serve as Lord of the Havens. 1,000 years into the Third Age, Círdan would receive 3 Istari, who sailed from Valinor to Middle-earth, landing at the Grey Havens. While in some accounts the number of Istari here is 5, Tolkien's later writings state the Blue Wizards would have come around 1600 of the Second Age, alongside the great elf Glorfindel. Upon meeting Gandalf, Círdan would give to him Narya, his Ring of Power, to aid the wizard in his efforts against Sauron. Though Lindon is diminished in power, it would still prove to be a valuable ally to the heirs of Elendil. For in the Angmar Wars of the Mid-Third Age, the Elves of Lindon would frequently aid the men of Arnor, often in partnership with the Elves of Rivendell. The Elves of Lindon would attempt to rescue the last king of the remnants of Arnor in 1975. Sailing from the Grey Havens, they would go to the ice bay of Forochel. While they would find King Arvedui, the ship was doomed, and all aboard would perish in the sea. The next year would bring a conclusion to this centuries-long war, as a great Gondorian host would sail from their ports in the south up to the Grey Havens. So great was this force that it not only filled this port, but also Forlond and Harlond. While the Elves of Rivendell would also aid the men, we are told Círdan led the host of the West to victory at the Battle of Fornost. This battle, which also featured hobbit archers, would prove crushing for the Witch King of Angmar. His forces of orcs and men would be totally destroyed, and he would be forced to flee back to Mordor. Later, in 1318, after the One Ring had been revealed, Círdan would send an elf named Galdor to Rivendell. His true purpose was to represent Círdan at the Council of Elrond, where the fate of the One Ring would be decided. The Havens would also come into play after the final downfall of Sauron. Many of the few remaining Noldor would finally leave Middle-earth behind, sailing from Círdan's realm. And on September 22nd, 3021, Círdan would see the Ring-bearers board the White Ship. Among these great allies were Gandalf, Galadriel, Elrond, and Bilbo and Frodo Baggins. Likely diminished even more in the Fourth Age, Círdan would continue to lead whatever remained of Lindon from the Grey Havens. He would likely have also seen Samwise Gamgee sail west some 61 years after Frodo. Eventually, however, the Grey Havens would have no further purpose in Middle-earth, for a day would come when no more elves wished to make the journey to Valinor. So, at some unknown date, decades later into the Fourth Age, Círdan would take the last ship, which he had constructed. Joined by Celeborn, they would take the straight road to the Undying Lands, leaving the lands of Lindon and the Grey Havens behind. Like many other elven realms, it would presumably cease to be in the Fourth Age. Itself a remnant of the elven glory of the First Age, Lindon would dwindle throughout its history, though it would never cease to aid the free peoples in the struggle against the dark powers of Middle-earth. Next, we explore in depth a realm that outlives Lindon, the Grey Havens. Like so much of the Middle-earth we see in the later Third Age, the Grey Havens rise from the ashes of the First Age. After the destruction of Beleriand, the area that was once well inland is now the coastline of Middle-earth. And lying in the middle of the new elven realm of Lindon is the Gulf of Lune. It is here that the elves, in the first year of the Second Age, would construct what would be their greatest port throughout the ages to come, the Grey Havens. While Gil-galad is the High King of the Noldor, Círdan the Shipwright would be the Lord of the Havens. After the havens of Falos and Sirion of Beleriand, this would be Círdan's third such lordship. While it is not explicitly stated, It's entirely possible, and perhaps even likely, that Elrond's brother Elros sails from the Grey Havens when he and the Edain go to discover the land of Numenor. Should this have been the case, it would be yet another emotional parting that happened on these great shores. Still, the Numenorians would not remain confined to their island forever. In the year 600 of the Second Age, a captain of Numenor named Veantur lands at the Grey Havens, meeting Círdan and Gil-galad. Aside from the elves, we are also told a dozen men of Eriador come to see what they believed was ones who had returned from death in the deeps of the sea. From here, the Numenorians would begin many voyages to Middle-earth, but none would sail so many as Aldarion. Aldarion, whose full tale will be told in a future video, would first sail to the Grey Havens with Veantur himself, his maternal grandfather. Aldarion would make nearly a dozen journeys to Middle-earth, including some to the Grey Havens. In 882, he would return from such a journey bearing a letter from Gil-galad to the king of Numenor, warning of a new shadow rising in the east, a servant of Morgoth. Over 800 years later, Sauron, having earlier led the elves in the creation of the Rings of Power, would make war upon Eriador with great force. After destroying Eregion, he sets his sights upon Lindon. From 1693 to 1699, Sauron's forces overrun most of Eriador and besiege both Lindon and Rivendell. The elves hold the line at the River Lune, protecting most of their lands, including the Grey Havens. Finally, in 1700 of the Second Age, the Numenorians come to their aid. Led by Ciriatur, this great force of Numenorians helps the elves in driving Sauron back. The Dark Lord's army would suffer further losses at Sarn Ford, and what would later be known as the Brandywine River. As Sauron is driven back to the River Gwathlo, the army of men and elves would be joined by a second force, sent up the river by Ciriatur, and Sauron is forced to flee with only a small bodyguard back to Mordor. Covered in much detail elsewhere, Sauron would lead Numenor to destruction, and Círdan himself would play a role in the Dark Lord's defeat at the hands of the Last Alliance. Gil-galad would fall in the battle, and Lindon's prominence would wane. While Rivendell would become the most notable location for the elves, Círdan would rule the remnant of elves in Lindon, and most notably, the Grey Havens, from which the elves could sail the straight road into the west, to the lands of Valinor. Later, in the year 1000 of the Third Age, the Astari would sail east, sent from the Undying Lands to aid the peoples of Middle-earth. They land at the Grey Havens, and upon meeting Gandalf the Grey, Círdan gives to him Narya, the Ring of Fire, one of the three which Sauron most sought. While initially Tolkien stated that all 5 wizards come to Middle-earth at this time, it's worth noting that in his later writings, he states the 2 blue wizards instead arrived around 1600 of the Second Age, the same time that Glorfindel is sent back to Middle-earth. Nearly 1,000 years later, the Grey Havens would again be an important location for men in war. During Arnor's wars with the Witch King, Gondor would send a great fleet to the Grey Havens in an effort to assist the remnant realm of Arthedain. It is said that this fleet was so great that their ships filled the Grey Havens, Forlond and Harlond. While Arthedain, and by extension Arnor, would cease to exist after this conflict, the Gondorian reinforcements were pivotal in Angmar's eventual defeat. The Grey Havens would next, and most famously, be remembered from the final days of the Third Age. After the destruction of the One Ring and the final defeat of the Dark Lord, Círdan would prepare the White Ship to carry the bearers of the 3 rings. Gandalf, Galadriel, and Elrond would take this ship, along with Bilbo and Frodo Baggins, permitted to take the journey having been bearers of the One. This sailing, taking place on September 29, 3021, is the final day of the Third Age. The Grey Havens would remain kept by Círdan well into the Fourth Age. and it is said that Samwise Gamgee would take the same path as his master in the year 61, at the age of 102. Yet Círdan knew that eventually his time to finally see Valinor would come, and the Grey Havens would no longer be needed. At some unknown date, Celeborn would come to the Grey Havens and take the last ship. Together, Círdan and Celeborn would sail to the Undying Lands, taking with them the last memories of the elder days of Middle-earth. And finally, Círdan and Celeborn would experience what Frodo had all those years ago. And the ship went out into the high sea and passed on into the west, until at last, on a night of rain, Frodo smelled a sweet fragrance on the air and heard the sound of singing that came over the water. And then it seemed to him that as in his dream in the House of Bombadil, the gray rain curtain turned all to silver glass and was rolled back, and he beheld white shores, and beyond them a far green country under a swift sunrise. Moving inland, we turn our exploration to a realm that came to define the Second Age, Eregion. After the lands of Beleriand fall into the sea at the end of the First Age, many of the Noldor who both survived and chose to remain in Middle-earth settle in the newly established realm of Lindon. Aside from a few small islands off the coast, these lands are all that remain of the former Beleriand. They are led by Gil-galad, now High King of the Noldor after the death of Turgon in the fall of Gondolin. As the Second Age gets underway, many of the Teleri, survivors of Doriath and Osiriand, would make their way east to establish realms among the Sylvan Elves. However, we would also see Noldor leave as well. One of the earliest to leave is Galadriel with her husband Celeborn. She would leave her grandnephew Gil-galad's realm to dwell near Lake Nanuiel. Yet there was another notable citizen of Lindon, Celebrimbor, the grandson of Feanor, creator of the Silmarils and greatest craftsman to ever live. After some 700 years in Lindon, Celebrimbor and many other Noldor leave. They are drawn eastward not by ambition to rule their own land, but by the promise of the Mithril being mined by the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. In 750 of the Second Age, these Noldorin elves establish the realm of Eregion and begin to build the capital of Ostin Ethil, which means Fortress of the Eldar. Ostin Ethil lies near the Ciranon River, many miles downstream from the west gate of Moria. A great friendship forms between the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the elves of Eregion. They not only live in peace with one another, but they trade freely, with a high road running from Ostin Ethil to the west gate of Moria. Among the elves, Celebrimbor leads a guild of craftsmen called the Gwaith y Myrdain, the people of the jewelsmiths. Their work was so marvelous, it is said to be the greatest since the time of Feanor himself. The Myrdain also work directly with the dwarves. It is Celebrimbor himself who helps the dwarf Narvi to build the Doors of Durin. From Mithril, the Myrdain are able to create Ithildin, the substance used to create moon runes, which reflect the light of the moon and stars. As Tolkien states, the elves and dwarves had great profit from this association, so that Eregion became far stronger, and Khazad-dûm far more beautiful than either would have done alone. But Tolkien goes on to mention in Unfinished Tales, news of these things came to the ears of Sauron, and increased the fears that he felt concerning the coming of the Númenóreans to Lindon, and the coasts further south, and their friendship with Gil-galad. And he heard tell also of Aldarion, son of Tar-Meneldur, the king of Númenor, now become a great shipbuilder, who brought his vessels to havens far down into the Harad. Sauron therefore left Eriador alone for a while, and he chose the land of Mordor, as it was afterwards called, for a stronghold, as a counter to the threat of the Númenórean landings. When he felt himself to be secure, he sent emissaries to Eriador, and finally, in about the year 1200 of the Second Age, came himself, wearing the fairest form that he could contrive. After raising his stronghold of Mordor to combat the threat of Numenor, Sauron makes his move against the elves of Eriador, fearing a great alliance of men, elves, and dwarves. After being turned away by Gil-galad and Elrond and Lindon, he comes to Eregion, where under the guise of Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, he comes to befriend the elves. Like Gil-galad and Elrond, we are told Galadriel does not fall for this fair visage of Sauron. And this is where things get interesting from a canon perspective. In Unfinished Tales, we get a version of the text that seems to imply it may have been Galadriel and Celeborn who actually founded Eregion, presumably leading them until Annatar's presence creates a rift. In this version, we find that Galadriel perceived the Dark Lord stirring in Middle-earth as early as the year 500 of the Second Age. This is what leads her and Celeborn to make their move east, for Galadriel believed this residue of evil could only be fought by an alliance of all its enemies. Here we find that Annatar spends 150 to 200 years influencing the Gwaith'i Myrdain, all while returning Galadriel's scorn with outward patience and courtesy. Finally, between 1350 and 1400 of the Second Age, he moves to expel Galadriel, convincing Celebrimbor and the Gwaith'i Myrdain to rebel against the Lord and Lady. And here we can resume what is the more clear-cut version of events. Galadriel and her daughter Celebrian leave through Khazad-dûm, coming to the elven realm of Lorinand. Celeborn, who is not fond of dwarves, no doubt due to their race's role in the fall of Doriath, stays in Eregion, where he is largely ignored by Celebrimbor and Annatar. After centuries of Annatar's tutelage, the Gwaith'i Myrdain forged 16 great rings of power, and around 1500, Sauron leaves Eregion, making his way back to Mordor. Meanwhile, Celebrimbor and his jewelsmiths use their newfound knowledge to create 3 more rings, without Sauron's knowledge or involvement. These 3 rings are completed around 1590 of the Second Age, and just 10 years later, Sauron forges his 1 ring in the fires of Mount Doom, made to bring all other ring-bearers under his sway. However, the moment Sauron puts on his master ring, he and his treachery become known to the elves bearing the 3. Celebrimbor, who was not corrupted in heart or faith, but had merely accepted Sauron as what he posed to be, immediately revolts against Sauron. He travels to Lorinand, seeking once again the counsel of Galadriel. Galadriel in turn says the rings should be hidden, never used, and dispersed far from Eregion, where Sauron would believe them to be. Thus Celebrimbor gives to Galadriel Nenya, the Ring of Water, which she would keep for all her remaining days in Middle-earth. Vilya and Narya are sent to Gil-galad in Lindon, with the Ring of Air being kept by the king, and the Ring of Fire kept by Círdan the shipwright. Upon learning of Celebrimbor's defiance, Sauron discards his fair visage, taking on the form of cruelty and power he would use to drive his armies in war. In 1695, he leads his host out of Mordor, marching north to Eregion. This attack would come sooner were it not for the 2 blue wizards, who worked against him in the east and south. Thus, his recruitment in these lands did not go as smoothly as he hoped. Still, he would come to Eregion with great force, as Gil-galad sends Elrond to reinforce their fellow elves. Celeborn leads an initial sortie out of Eregion, driving back the vanguard of Sauron's host. Celeborn would then combine forces with Elrond as the latter arrives. However, Sauron's main host would come, driving them back and surrounding Eregion, cutting Celeborn and Elrond off from Ostin Ethil. The capital would fall in 1697. Celebrimbor makes a valiant last stand on the very steps of the House of the Myrdain. He is taken captive and tortured by Sauron, leading the Dark Lord to take possession of the 16 rings. However, Celebrimbor would tell nothing of the 3, which Sauron coveted above all others. Celebrimbor dies from his torment, and his body is shot with orc arrows. Sauron then has his body placed on a pole and used as a banner as they turn toward the host of Elrond. Elrond's forces would have been destroyed were it not for the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, who attacked Sauron's rear, diverting his attention and allowing Elrond, Celeborn, and the survivors of Eregion to escape north, where they would establish Rivendell. The doors of Durin are closed, and the host of Sauron would destroy Ostin Ethil and ravage not only Eregion, but most of Eriador over the coming years. While the War of the Elves and Sauron would rage on, the realm of Eregion would be no more, dying along with its lord. Despite its demise in 1697 of the Second Age, the effects of this elven realm would be felt to the very latest days of the Third Age, not only in the Rings of Power and their role over the centuries, but in the land itself. Over 4,700 years later, the Fellowship of the Ring would pass through the former lands of Eregion on their quest. Now widely known as Hollin, we see the very land speaks of the elves who once dwelt there.
We cannot look too far ahead. Let us be glad that the first stage is safely over. I think we will rest here, not only today but tonight as well. There's a wholesome air about Hollin. Much evil must befall a country before it wholly forgets the elves, if once they dwelt there.
That is true, said Legolas. But the elves of this land were of a race strange to us of the Sylvan folk, and the trees and the grass do not now remember them. Only I hear the stones lament them. Deep they delved us, fair they wrought us, high they builded us, but they are gone. They are gone. They sought the havens long ago. The Fellowship travels for many miles on the now broken and decayed road that once led from Ostin Ethil to the very doors of Moria. A stark reminder of these great realms that once were, the friendship that thrived between them, and the evil that befell at the hands of Sauron. From the wars of the Second Age, a new elven realm would emerge, one that would play a memorable and significant part in the tale of the Ring, Rivendell. The story of Imladris begins as the War of the Elves and Sauron begins. With Sauron having sacked the city of Ostin Ethil, Elrond leads an army from Lindon in an attempt to aid the elves of Eregion. Elrond is met by a group of these elves led by Celeborn. Despite the reinforcement, they are unable to reach the realm, as Sauron's forces are simply too great. As Elrond is facing utter defeat, the elves are saved by the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, who attack Sauron's rear guard, dividing his attention and allowing the elves to retreat. Elrond leads the elves north along the Bruinen to the valley near the Misty Mountains, establishing Imladris, which means Deep Dale of the Cleft. It becomes a safe haven for elven refugees as Sauron continues his march throughout all of Eriador. Among these refugees of Eregion is of course Celeborn. Sauron's great army not only makes its way ever closer to Lindon, but also lays siege to Imladris. Finally, in 1700 of the Second Age, a great force of Númenóreans arrive in Lindon to aid the elves of Middle-earth. Gil-galad, who is barely holding the line near the river Lune, is reinforced by the Númenóreans, and they drive back the forces of Sauron. The siege of Rivendell is broken, and Sauron is driven from Eriador the following year, retreating back to Mordor. At this time, Gil-galad gives to Elrond his Ring of Power, Vilya, the Ring of Air. We are also told around this time that a meeting was held of the White Council. We are not told exactly who took part, though it would not include later members Gandalf and Saruman, as they would not arrive in Middle-earth until 1000 of the Third Age. However, it is decided in this meeting that Imladris would become a new stronghold of the elves in Eriador, and that Elrond would rule there as Gil-galad's vice-regent. That same year, Galadriel and her daughter Celebrian come to Rivendell searching for Celeborn. Celebrian would not only discover her father alive and well, but it is here she would first meet Elrond. Over 1700 years later, Rivendell would host one of the greatest armies ever assembled in Middle-earth. As Sauron moves against Gondor, Gil-galad and Elendil formed the last alliance of elves and men at Amon-Sul and marched to Rivendell. The army spends the next 3 years there, gathering their forces, forging weapons, and making battle plans. In 3434, Elrond marches with Gil-galad in the War of the Last Alliance, but only one would return. With the death of Gil-galad, Elrond could have claimed the title of High King of the Noldor, but he would not, as there were so few Noldor remaining in Middle-earth. He returns to Rivendell, where it would thrive under his rule, and with the help of his Ring of Power. Remaining in Rivendell are Isildur's wife and youngest son, Valinor. It is when Isildur is on his return journey to Rivendell years later that he and his 3 eldest sons are killed in the disaster of the Gladden Fields. Thus, Valinor would be the first of the heirs of Isildur to be fostered in Rivendell, living there until he was 21 years old, when he would take the rule of the northern kingdom of Arnor. In 109 of the Third Age, Elrond and Celebrian are married, and go on to have 3 children. The twin sons, Elladan and Elrohir, are born in 130, and their daughter Arwen follows in 241. Over the centuries of the Third Age, Rivendell would remain a refuge of the heirs of Isildur, men who were related to Elrond himself through his brother and the first king of Númenor, Elros. Rivendell and Arnor would remain allies throughout the latter's existence. However, both realms would face a great enemy around 1300 of the Third Age, as the Witch Kingdom of Angmar is established in the north. The Angmar War would last for over 600 years. In the early days of the conflict, Angmar would attack Rivendell, resulting in the Second Siege of Imladris. By 1409, the siege is broken, as Elrond is reinforced by elves from Lothlorien and Lindon, driving the forces of Angmar from their lands and subduing the Witch King for many years. By 1975, the remnants of Arnor cease to exist at the end of the Angmar War, and their people only continue in the form of the Dunedain Rangers. Beginning with Arahel, the second chieftain of the Dunedain, the heirs of Isildur would be fostered in Rivendell, down their line all the way to Aragorn. It is also at this time that the heirlooms of their house would be moved to Rivendell, now that their kingdom was no more. Among these are the shards of Narsil. Throughout the Third Age, Rivendell would play host to many travelers, making their way between the eastern and western portions of Middle-earth. In 2941, Bilbo makes his first journey to Rivendell as a member of Thorin's company. During this time, we also get our first description of the greatness of Elrond's realm. His house was perfect, whether you liked food, or sleep, or work, or storytelling, or singing, or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. Evil things did not come into that valley. Not only would Bilbo return there on his way home with Gandalf, but he would also move to Rivendell after his 111th birthday. With the exception of a few later life travels, Bilbo would live out most of his remaining days in Middle-earth in the House of Elrond, writing his book. In 3018, Frodo Baggins would make his journey bearing the One Ring to Rivendell, and it is here that we would see the defensive power of Imladris, through the magic of Elrond and Gandalf. Frodo defies the Nazgul pursuing him to the ford of Bruinen, who are swept away by the river. Gandalf later tells Frodo of their magic defense. "Who made the flood?" asked Frodo.
"Elrond commanded it," answered Gandalf. "The river of this valley is under his power, and it will rise in anger when he has great need to bar the ford. As soon as the captain of the ring race rode into the water, the flood was released. If I may say so, I added a few touches of my own. You may not have noticed, but some of the waves took the form of great white horses, with shining white riders, and there were many rolling and grinding boulders. For a moment I was afraid we had let loose too fierce a wrath, and that the flood would get out of hand and wash you all away. There is great vigor in the waters that come down from the snows of the Misty Mountains.
During this trip to Rivendell, we are also introduced to a special location, the Hall of Fire, where the hobbits are reunited with Bilbo.
This is the Hall of Fire. Here you will hear many songs and tales, if you can keep awake. But except on high days, it usually stands empty and quiet, and people come here who wish for peace and thought. There is always a fire here, all year round, but there is little other light.
Further showing the importance of both Rivendell and Elrond, the hobbits not only meet Bilbo in Elrond's house, but folk from all about Middle-earth, seeking his counsel. Gimli and Glóin from the Lonely Mountain, Legolas from the Woodland Realm, and Boromir of Gondor. All would take part in the Great Council of Elrond, and on December 25th, the Fellowship of the Ring would depart Rivendell on the hopeless errand to destroy the One Ring. Rivendell next comes into the story after the One Ring's destruction, the marriage of Aragorn and Arwen, and the funeral of King Theoden. We are told that Gandalf and the hobbits say goodbye to many of their friends at Isengard, and accompany Elrond back to Rivendell. With the One Ring destroyed, the power of Elrond's ring would diminish as well. He remains in Rivendell for roughly 2 years before departing on the White Ship with Gandalf, Galadriel, Bilbo, Frodo, and Shadowfax sailing to the Undying Lands. Though Elrond had departed Middle-earth and Arwen was now Queen of Gondor, 2 of their family would remain in Rivendell. Elrond's twin sons Elladan and Elrohir remain behind for at least some time. With the departure of his wife, Celeborn grows weary of Lorien, and it is believed that he would also relocate to Rivendell. At some point after the year 61 of the Fourth Age, Celeborn would sail with Círdan on the last ship, taking the last memories of the Elder Days to Valinor. As for Elrond's sons, we don't know if they eventually sailed west themselves, or perhaps moved elsewhere in Middle-earth to linger on. But as Aragorn is nearing death in 120 of the Fourth Age, he says to Arwen that none now walk in the Garden of Elrond, implying that by this time, Rivendell had finally faded, and the elves had departed the Great Realm forever. As we look at one last description of Rivendell, my wish for all this holiday is that we would all find our own little slice of Imladris, where we can escape the worries of the world. For a while, the hobbits continued to talk and think of the past journey and of the perils that lay ahead. But such was the virtue of the land of Rivendell, that soon all fear and anxiety were lifted from their minds. The future, good or ill, was not forgotten, but ceased to have any power over the present.
Rivendell would not be the only realm to host the Ringbearer. Our next realm would also play a significant part in that tale. But beyond that, it would be one of the most famous and mysterious realms of the elves, Lothlorien.
The land that would come to be known as Lothlorien, or simply Lorien, is first settled by a group of Teleri elves. These elves break off from the larger group of elves making the great journey to Valinor around the Year of the Trees 1115. While the Vanyar and Noldor are led by Orome across the Hithyglir, later known as the Misty Mountains, some of the Teleri opt to travel south along the Great River. These elves come to be known as the Nandor, and would include the 2 groups known as the Sylvan Elves and the Green Elves. Now, the Elven groups can be a bit much to keep straight, so after this video, check out my Clans of the Elves video for a full explanation of every group. While the Green Elves make their way as far as Osiriand, others would remain much closer to where they are sundered from the elves taking the Great Journey. It is believed that while initially these Sylvan Elves were scattered across smaller settlements in places around the vales and mouths of Anduin as well as Eriador, the rise of the Longbeards in Khazad-dûm led these Nandor to relocate. Thus, the Sylvan Elves would primarily be found in the forest of Greenwood the Great
and a smaller forest known in the Sylvan tongue as Lorinand, the Valley of Gold, also known as Lorelindorinan, the Valley of Singing Gold. After the destruction of Beleriand at the end of the First Age, most of the Noldorin and Sindarin elves retreat to Lindon. Despite being invited by the Valar to go to Aman, many refuse and opt to stay in Middle-earth. Among these are more famous elves such as Galadriel, Celeborn, Gil-galad, Elrond, and Celebrimbor, but another such elf is Amdir, who, like Celeborn, is one of the Sindar. He and his son Amroth traveled to Lorinand, and Amdir would eventually become the king of this group of Sylvan elves. A similar situation would play out among the Nandor and Greenwood the Great as well. In 750 of the Second Age, Orofer and his son Thranduil would arrive in what would later be known as Mirkwood, where Orofer is taken by the Sylvan elves as their lord and founds the Woodland Realm. While we see in both cases a Sindarin elf being taken as leader among Sylvan elves, it's important to note that these group of elves are less different than you might imagine. In the end, they are all of Teleri descent, and their different clan names are likely seen as less dramatic than that between Noldor, Teleri, and Vanyar. While Orofer and Amdir ruled over their Sylvan realms, another Sindarin elf and his Noldorin wife moved throughout Eriador before settling in Eregion and making contact with the elves of Lorinand. And while Celeborn would remain in Eregion until the war with Sauron, Galadriel and their daughter Celebrian would pass with others through Khazad-dûm, arriving in the forest on the eastern side of the mountain. Before Eregion falls to Sauron, Celebrimbor would send one of the 3 elven rings of power, which he had forged in secret, to Galadriel. From that moment on, Nenya, the Ring of Water, would be in Galadriel's possession. When Elrond brings a force from Lindon to aid the elves of Eregion, Prince Amroth leads a force from Lorinand through Khazad-dûm to aid as well. However, they and the dwarves assisting in the battle are driven back into Khazad-dûm in 1697, when Eregion is laid waste by Sauron's horde. After the arrival of the Númenóreans in 1701, Sauron is defeated and driven out of Eriador, with only a bodyguard left of his massive army. Galadriel and Celebrian would take their leave of Amdir and go in search of Celeborn, his fate in the war unknown to them. They would reunite with him in the newly established Rivendell. Over the coming centuries, Sauron's power would grow, and he would begin to move against the relatively new Mannish realm of Gondor in the south. With the Dark Lord's power and influence growing, Elendil and Gil-galad form the last alliance of elves and men. In response, King Amdir gathers a force of his people to join the war. The elves of Lorinand are by this time known by a new name, the Galathrim, for they were not only comprised of Sylvan elves, but also other Nandor, Noldor, and Sindar. Amdir, Amroth, and the Galathrim join the forces of Elendil and Gil-galad, along with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the elves of the Woodland Realm under Orofer and Thranduil. In 3434 of the Second Age, the last alliance meets the forces of Mordor in the Battle of Dagorlad. Unfortunately, Orofer and his Sylvan elves defy High King Gil-galad's command and charge the host of Mordor before being given any such order. As a result of this ill-advised charge, Orofer is killed in the onslaught, and Amdir and his troops are cut off from the main host. They are driven into the nearby marshland, and over the course of the months-long Battle of Dagorlad, half of the Galathrim are killed. Their bodies, along with those of the orcs and Amdir himself, would ever after lie in the dead marshes. Amroth survives the war that would end 7 years later in 3441. He would take over his father's role as king, though he would grow tired of Middle-earth, wishing to go west and seek Valinor. When Moria is taken over by the Balrog in 1981 of the Third Age, many of the Galathrim flee south, and this event brings Amroth to make a great change as well. Now, one of the earliest inhabitants of Lorinand we know by name is the elf maid Nimrodel. We are told she lived there even before the arrival of Amdir and Amroth, and she did not care for the newcomers, for she believed they would bring the turmoils of Middle-earth to Lorien itself, and indeed she would lament their arrival, saying they had brought wars and destroyed peace. The only thing she saw as good in the entire ordeal was the Prince Amroth himself. While they loved one another, Nimrodel would not agree to marry Amroth. So for many long centuries, the king would not take a wife. After many debates, Nimrodel told Amroth she would marry him if he took her to a land of peace. They set out southward, coming to Gondor in the very year the Balrog took Moria. For a time, they are separated as Amroth goes to the havens alone, finding a few elves who wanted to sail west. Because of Amroth's love for Nimrodel, the elves agree to wait for her. They do so for a long while, until one night a storm begins to sweep them out to sea, and they are forced to sail. Amroth awakes at dawn, realizing he is now far from the shore, and dives into the sea, fighting against the waves to get back to his beloved. And there, by the Bay of Belfalas, the king is drowned. In honor of the last king of Lorien, the nearby Gondorian princedom and its city would be known ever after as Dol Amroth. Nimrodel would come to Aethelond, but she would not find Amroth, and what became of her, no tale tells. Celeborn would return with Galadriel to the land where she had dwelt for many years during the turmoil in Eriador. With Amroth and Nimrodel gone, Celeborn and Galadriel are taken as rulers of the realm. However, they do not use the titles of king and queen, but rather lord and lady. With Sauron defeated and his one ring lost, Galadriel is free to use her ring of power to keep the forest pure and alive. Unlike the nearby Mirkwood, Galadriel's ring allows her to keep the forest free of evil. Under the Lord and Lady, the Galathrim build the city and fortress of Caras Galadhon in response to the growing threat of Dol Guldur. In this city, Galadriel plants Malorn seeds that were given to her by Gil-galad long ago when she lived in Lindon, a land where they were unable to grow. But here, they thrive. So much so that the land comes to be known as Lothlorien, often shortened to Lorien, which means golden wood. The realm shares its name with both a person and a location in Valinor. The Vala Irmo, the master of visions and dreams, is more commonly known by the name Lorien. This is also the name of the gardens he and his wife Este keep in Valinor. The Gardens of Lorien is known as the most beautiful place not only in Valinor, but all of Arda. It is known for its silver willows, flowers, lakes, and singing nightingales. As for the Lorien of Middle-earth, with the power of Galadriel's ring, it is filled with light and beauty, and the trees do not die. Indeed, well over 1,000 years pass, with no decay in the heart of elvendom on Earth. Galadriel and Celeborn would often be visited in Lorien by their family from Rivendell. Their daughter Celebrian, who had married Elrond and had 3 children, would visit her parents on occasion. Sadly, it was on one of these journeys in 2509 that she would be waylaid by orcs and given a poisoned wound. While rescued by her sons Elladan and Elrohir, and healed of her physical wounds by Elrond, she could not recover in mind nor spirit and sailed west the following year. In 2941, as Bilbo and the dwarves are on the quest of Erebor, the White Council resolves to attack Sauron's fortress of Dol Guldur. We know for certain that Galadriel was involved in the attack, and it's likely that Celeborn is a member of the council and present for the assault as well. In days to come, the Lord and Lady would often be visited by Celebrian's daughter, Arwen. During one such visit in the summer of 2980, Arwen would meet Aragorn for the second time as the latter rests from long travels. They meet upon the hill of Cairn Emroth, and there they pledge to marry one another. Aragorn would once again pass through Lothlorien in 3017, after capturing Gollum in the Dead Marshes. Just 2 years later, in 3019, Lothlorien would play its largest role yet in the battle against Sauron. The Border Wardens of the realm discover the remaining 8 members of the Fellowship of the Ring. The elven soldiers lead the group blindfolded toward Caras Galadhon. When the Fellowship had arrived at the river Nimrodel, named for the elf maid of old, Legolas bathes his feet in the waters, which are believed to bring healing to the weary. It turns out the tale of Amroth and Nimrodel, and the stream which bore her name, was famous even to the elves of Mirkwood, for Legolas recites for the group a song. An elven maid there was of old, a shining star by day. Her mantle white was helmed with gold, her shoes of silver gray. A star was bound upon her brows, a light was on her hair, as sun upon the golden boughs, in Lorien the fair. Her hair was long, her limbs were white, and fair she was and free, and in the wind she went as light as leaf of linden tree. Beside the falls of Nimrodel, by water clear and cool, her voice as falling silver fell into the shining pool. Where now she wanders none can tell, in sunlight or in shade, for lost of yore was Nimrodel, and in the mountains strayed. The elven ship in haven gray, beneath the mountain lee, awaited her for many a day, beside the roaring sea. A wind by night in northern lands arose and loud it cried, and drove the ship from elven strands across the streaming tide. When dawn came dim the land was lost, the mountains sinking gray, beyond the heaving waves that tossed their plumes of blinding spray. Amroth beheld the fading shore, now low beyond the swell, and cursed the faithless ship that bore him far from Nimrodel. Of old he was an elven king, a lord of tree and glen, when golden were the boughs in spring, in fair Lothlorien. From helm to sea they saw him leap, as arrow from the string, and dive into the water deep, as mew upon the wing. The wind was in his flowing hair, the foam about him shone. Afar they saw him strong and fair, go riding like a swan. But from the west has come no word, and on the hither shore no tidings elven folk have heard of Amroth evermore. The Fellowship arrives at Caras Galadhon on January 17th, and on that very day a band of orcs crosses the Nimrodel in pursuit. The Galadhrim dispatch a regiment of elves, and the orcs are destroyed. The Fellowship would spend a month in Lothlorien, though we see through the eyes of the hobbits that it does not seem nearly so long. Sam is bewildered to see the moon in the same phase as when they arrived, and Frodo recalls for certain 3 nights within the realm, and feels he can remember several more, but swears it could not have been an entire month. Legolas and Aragorn explain that time does not pass for mortals in Lorien as it does outside. Said Aragorn, "But so it is, Sam. In that land you lost your count. There time flowed swiftly by us. As for the elves, the old moon passed, and a new moon waxed and waned in the world outside, while we tarried there. And yestereve a new moon came again. Winter is nearly gone, time flows on to a spring of little hope." As we know well, their days in Lothlorien are marked with grieving for Gandalf, the mirror of Galadriel and the revealing of her elven ring, and gifts from the Lord and Lady to the Fellowship. And on February 16, 3019, the Fellowship bids farewell to Lorien. But this would not be the end of the Galadhrim involvement in the war, not by a long shot. For the very next day, Gwaihir bears a resurrected Gandalf to Lothlorien, where he is welcomed by Galadriel and Celeborn. There he is healed, clothed in white garments, and given a new staff before he sets off for Fangorn Forest. Just a few weeks later, the War of the Ring would come in full force to the Golden Wood itself. On March 11th, an army from Dol Guldur launches a full-scale assault upon Lorien. Between the might of the Wood Elves and Galadriel's ring, they are repelled. 4 days later, a second attack comes in coordination with an attack on Thranduil's realm in the north. Once again, the invaders are forced to retreat. 1 week later, the third and mightiest attack is launched on their realm from Dol Guldur. During this final attack, much destruction is caused on the wood's borders, but the orcs are routed once again by the Galadhrim. It is said that the power of Galadriel's ring was too great to overcome, unless Sauron were to come there himself. 3 days later, the ring is destroyed, and on March 28th, Lorien turns to the offensive. The army, led by Celeborn, storms Dol Guldur and takes control of the fortress. Galadriel then throws down its walls and lays bare its pits, cleansing the forest of Sauron's influence once and for all. On April 6th, Celeborn and Thranduil meet in Mirkwood and rename it Erin las Galan, the Wood of Green Leaves. Thranduil takes the portion of the forest north of the mountains of Mirkwood to rule, while Celeborn takes the land south of the Narrows, which he names East Lorien. The central region they give to the Beornings and Woodmen. With Sauron defeated and the War of the North won, Elrond and Arwen come to Lorien on May 20th. Joined by Celeborn and Galadriel, they would make their way to Gondor, where Arwen would marry Aragorn and become queen. 2.5 years later, Galadriel would join Elrond, Gandalf, Bilbo, and Frodo in sailing west on the White Ship, leaving Middle-earth forever on September 29th, 3021. Celeborn remains in Lorien for a time, ruling the remaining Galathrim of both Lorien and East Lorien. However, without his lady, the Lord would grow weary and leave for Rivendell, which was at this time inhabited by his grandsons Elladan and Elrohir. Sometime after the year 61 of the Fourth Age, Celeborn would join Círdan the shipwright on the last ship, sailing to the Undying Lands. We are told that the wooded land of East Lorien is now populated by only a few wandering Sylvan elves. The final mention we have of Lorien comes in the final days of the life of Arwen Undomiel. In 121 of the Fourth Age, after the death of Aragorn and bidding farewell to her children, the grief-filled Queen of Gondor returns to the forest of Lorien, which is now fully abandoned. She lays down upon Cairn Amroth, the very hill where she and Aragorn were betrothed, and surrenders her life. And there is her green grave, until the world is changed, and all the days of her life are utterly forgotten. While the passing of the power of the rings would lead Lorien to fade, its beauty would be remembered not only by those who had seen it, but by the beauty it had passed on. For Galadriel's gift to Samwise Gamgee had been a box of soil, also containing a single silver Malorn nut. Sam would plant this nut in the party field where the party tree had stood before it was destroyed by ruffians. It was the only Malorn tree in Middle-earth outside of Lorien, but it is said when it bloomed the very summer after it was planted, all the Shire became golden from the flowers.
Our final realm has stretched the long ages of Middle-earth. While being most notable for appearing in The Hobbit, this realm's origins would be among the very earliest, and it would find itself involved in many great events of the Second and Third Ages. And it just might be the last kingdom of the Elves to survive into the Fourth Age, Mirkwood.
The first peoples to settle the forest of Mirkwood were some of the Teleri Elves. As we discussed in my video on the many clans of the Elves, one of the groups of the Teleri were the Nandor, and of the Nandor, there is a group that comes to be known as the Sylvan Elves. It is these Sylvan Elves who abandoned the Great Migration in the Vales of Anduin, west of the Misty Mountains. With their kin moving on toward Beleriand, the Sylvan Elves settle in the woodlands to their east, and while this would eventually be known as Mirkwood, for the greatest part of its existence, this forest is known as Greenwood the Great. Over time, the Sylvan Elves are joined by some of the wandering Avari, those elves who refused to join the Great Journey from its very beginning. But it would not only be the Sylvan Elves, also known as Wood Elves, that would step foot in Greenwood. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm would travel through Greenwood in order to go back and forth to their realm of the Iron Hills in the east. Accomplished road makers, they would build a path that goes through the forest. For many long years, it would be known as the Great Dwarf Road. We would know very little of what transpired in Greenwood over the course of the First and early Second Ages. It would be 750 years into the Second Age when this realm would become a kingdom. Around the same time that the Noldor under Celebrimbor established the realm of Eregion, A group of Sindarin elves led by Orofer goes even further east to Greenwood. There, the Sindarin elves would merge with the Sylvan elves, and they would take Orofer as their king, thus establishing the Kingdom of the Woodland Realm. Among the Sindar to accompany Orofer is his son, Thranduil. Unlike the grand kingdoms and fortresses of the First Age elves, and especially those common with the Noldor, Orofer seeks to embrace the simple, natural existence of the elves prior to the Great Journey. He and his people adopt the customs and language of the Sylvan elves, as evidenced in the name of Thranduil's eventual son, Legolas, a Sylvan elvish name. Initially, the Woodland Realm would be focused in the south of Greenwood. Orofer and his people would focus their dwellings around the hill of Amon Lanc. This location, translated as the Naked Hill, was the highest point in this area of the forest, and got its name because no trees grew upon the hill itself. Notably, the Sylvan elves would also dwell in the forest of Lorien, across the great river Anduin. These elves would be under the rule of another Sindarin elf, King Amroth. However, the actions of Sauron would disrupt the peoples of Greenwood the Great from as early as the Second Age. By 1697, Sauron has destroyed Eregion in his quest to reclaim all the Rings of Power. As he sets his sight on the elves of Lindon and causing mass destruction in Eriador, he tasks the orcs with disrupting the dwarves wherever they could be found. This leads directly to the sack of Gundabad, the ancient awakening place of Durin I, and frequent meeting place for the dwarves. The sack of Gundabad leads to the dwarves abandoning the Great Dwarf Road, and communication between Khazad-dûm and the Iron Hills is cut off by the orcs. This would no doubt lead to the decrepit state the road is found in thousands of years later during Bilbo's adventure, when it is simply known as the Old Forest Road. The elves, meanwhile, would move the Woodland Realm 3 times throughout its history. The first time, we are told, comes not as a result of Sauron, but of dwarves and another group of elves. Orofer moves his people north beyond the Gladden Fields to be free from the power and encroachments of the dwarves of Moria. Also, he is said to have resented the intrusions of Galadriel and Celeborn into Lorien. Orofer would move his people once again as the Second Age progresses. Concerned by reports of Sauron's growing power, the Woodland Realm would be centered around the western glens of the Eminduir by the end of the Second Age. Notably, it is said his numerous people would live and roam in the woods and vales westward as far as Anduin and north of the ancient Dwarf Road. While Orofer and his Sylvan elves would seek to stay out of the affairs of the Noldor and Sindar, not to mention those of dwarves, men, and orcs, Orofer was wise enough to foresee that true peace could not come to Middle-earth unless Sauron was overcome. So when Gil-galad and Elendil form the last alliance of elves and men, Orofer assembles a great army of his own to join the fight. We were told they were, by now, a numerous people. After all, the Sylvan elves have, as of yet, not been involved in any large-scale conflicts, unlike the Noldor and Sindar. While they are hardy and valiant in fighting alongside the host of Gil-galad, we are told their armor and weapons paled in comparison to the Eldar of the West. This, combined with their hesitancy to take orders from Gil-galad, leads to terrible losses of Sylvan elves in the War of the Last Alliance. Orofer himself is among the slain, and his son Thranduil is left to lead the survivors back to Greenwood. There he is crowned as the new king of the Woodland Realm. In one of his earliest recorded acts as king, Thranduil would learn of a group from Gondor being attacked by orcs near the Gladden Fields in the second year of the Third Age. This is first noticed by the Woodmen, men who lived in the forest of Greenwood and were on friendly terms with the elves. While messengers were sent to Thranduil, The woodmen themselves sent a force to attack the orcs and aid the Dunedain. Sadly, they are too late. Isildur and nearly all his company have been killed, and unknown to nearly all, the One Ring is lost to the river Anduin. The woodmen would only be able to drive away the orcs and prevent the mutilation of the bodies of the fallen men. Other than 2 men sent away with the shards of Narsil, there would be only one other survivor, a man discovered by the woodmen who had been knocked unconscious with a club and found under the body of Isildur's son. It is from this man, Estelmo, that we learn the final words between Isildur and his son Elendur. Thranduil would continue to rule the Woodland Realm during a period of roughly 1100 years of peace that follows Sauron's defeat. However, around the 1100th year of the Third Age, Sauron's evil would come directly to Greenwood. Known at this time as the Necromancer, Sauron takes over the abandoned fortress of Amon Lanc, which comes to be known as Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery. Sauron's evil would spread over Mirkwood, and as a result, Thranduil would once again relocate his people, settling in the northeast of the forest, just north of the Forest River. There the elves would build the Elven King's Halls, a stronghold consisting of a system of caves, reminiscent of the great halls of Thingol, king of Doriath. Meanwhile, the shadow of Sauron's influence spreads throughout the forest, leading it to be known in Sindarin as Tar Nufuin, which translates to forest under nightshade. This is the same name used to describe the forests of Dorthonion in the First Age, when Sauron's evil influence would infect those lands. But for this Third Age forest, it would commonly be known by the Mannish translation, Mirkwood. By 1636, a great plague kills countless people in Rhovanion, Gondor, and Eriador, coinciding with the evil of Sauron spreading in Mirkwood. And as the text says, many evil things reappeared, which were signs of Sauron's rise. Among these things is no doubt creatures like orcs and trolls, but also spiders. The spiders of Mirkwood were the children of Shelob, originating in the Efel Duath and spreading to places like Dol Guldur and the surrounding forest. Fortunately, there would be a respite from Sauron in store for Mirkwood. In 2063, Gandalf the Grey goes to Dol Guldur to investigate this necromancer, whom the wise originally believed to be one of the Nazgul. Not yet ready to reveal himself, Sauron flees, and for nearly 400 years, there would be a watchful peace in the Westlands of Middle-earth. Yet Sauron would return to Mirkwood with renewed strength in 2460, and from Dol Guldur, he would orchestrate the orcs spreading throughout the Misty Mountains, blocking routes to the west as well as taking up residence in Moria. Contributing to the dark outlook for this area of Middle-earth during this time is the arrival of the dragon Smaug, who sacks the dwarven kingdom of Erebor in 2770. 75 years later, King Thrain II, father of Thorin Oakenshield, would travel from their new home in the Blue Mountains and brave the crossing of the Misty Mountains and the lands of Mirkwood. As his company camps under the eaves of Mirkwood, Thrain disappears and would never again be seen by his people. In 2850, Gandalf once again enters Dol Guldur. This time he is undetected and discovers that the necromancer is indeed Sauron. There he also discovers a captured dwarf who gives him a key. The dwarf is in such a decrepit state that he does not know his own name. Gandalf would later come to realize that this dwarf was King Thrain, and the key was to the secret door of Erebor. Prior to Gandalf's arrival, Sauron had tortured Thrain and taken back the dwarven ring of power he possessed. Gandalf's discovery of Thrain would, in part, bring about one of the most famous journeys through Mirkwood in history. And in 2941 of the Third Age, the company of Thorin Oakenshield would enter its borders. One of the first encounters they have is with one of Mirkwood's most unique residents, Beorn, the Skin Changer. Bilbo and the rest of the company would stay in Beorn's home from July 20th to July 22nd. The great man, who is capable of transforming into a mighty bear, would aid the company by lending them ponies. He also gave them guidance on their path through Mirkwood. Their intended path had been the Men Inaugrim, the Old Dwarf Road. However, Beorn would inform them that the road was in disrepair and that the entrance was often used by goblins. Instead, he says they should go by the elf path. The company takes the elf road through the darkening forest, seeing cobwebs on either side. About halfway through this path, the company encounters a unique and perilous feature of northern Mirkwood, the Enchanted River. The water is black, and anyone who touches the water would fall into an enchanted sleep. Fortunately, the company discovers a boat to help them traverse the river. Unfortunately, Bombur, the heaviest of their companions, would fall in and would need to be carried by his companions for several days before he awoke. Prior to entering the forest, Gandalf would depart the company. Unknown to his companions, he would join the other members of the White Council in launching an attack on Dol Guldur. As a result, Sauron would flee to Mordor, and for a time, Dol Guldur would be clear of his influence. Meanwhile, Bilbo and the dwarves would have their first encounter with the elves of the Woodland Realm. 3 times the now foodless company would find this group of elves feasting in the forest. Yet each time the dwarves approached, they would put out their fires and plunge the company into darkness. This trickery causes the dwarves to leave the path, something they had been warned not to do should they wish to successfully complete the journey. Lost and separated, Bilbo and the dwarves would all be attacked by the vile creatures of Shelob's brood, the spiders of Mirkwood. In his cleverness, Bilbo is able to lure the spiders away and rescue the dwarves. Together, the company fends off the spiders when they return. However, they discover Thorin is not among them, having been captured by the elves. Soon afterward, the remaining dwarves are also captured and brought to Thranduil's halls in the north of Mirkwood. Bilbo follows using his magic ring, leaving this dark area of Mirkwood with a new purpose and a new name for his sword, Sting. The dwarves are brought before Thranduil, who questions them about their doings, where they are from, and where they are going. The dwarves are uncooperative.
"What have we done, O king?"
said Balin, who was the eldest left.
"Is it a crime to be lost in the forest? To be hungry and thirsty? To be trapped by spiders? Are the spiders your tame beasts or your pets, if killing them makes you angry?"
Such a question, of course, made the king angrier than ever, and he answered, "It is a crime to wander in my realm without leave. Do you forget that you were in my kingdom, using the road that my people made? Did you not 3 times pursue and trouble my people in the forest, and rouse the spiders with your riot and clamor? After all the disturbance you have made, I have the right to know what brings you here, and if you will not tell me now, I will keep you all in prison until you have learned sense and manners." Over the coming weeks, Bilbo would sneak around the Elven King's halls, always in hiding and wearing his ring. On occasion, he would sneak out when the Wood Elves, sometimes with Thranduil at the lead, would go out on a hunt or other business. However, it was risky, as he would nearly be caught in the doors as they shut. Not to mention, once shut, the doors were sealed with magic. For nearly a month, Bilbo would sneak his way throughout the elven dwelling, eventually finding the cells of all the dwarves, including Thorin. Bilbo then discovers a new way out of Thranduil's halls and orchestrates their grand escape via empty wine barrels. After the prison break, Thranduil receives word from the elves who transported barrels upstream, and he is able to deduce the dwarves' mission. In response, Thranduil says to himself, "Very well, we'll see." No treasure will come back through Mirkwood without my having something to say in the matter, but I expect they will all come to a bad end, and serve them right. The company would not come to a bad end. Instead, Thranduil learns of Smaug's demise. Being well aware of the treasure hoard within the mountain, but unaware of the dwarves' survival, Thranduil sets out to claim a share of the treasure. After giving aid to the men of Lake Town, Thranduil and Bard the Bowman lead their forces to Erebor, where they realize the dwarves had indeed survived. As we've covered in previous videos, there is strife between the men and elves and dwarves. Their differences are set aside with the arrival of an orc army under Bolg, and the battle of 5 armies ensues. Though victorious, we are told many wood elves were slain in the conflict. It seems they would be avenged, as many of the surviving orcs flee into the Great Forest, where they are either slain by elves or drawn in to die deep in the trackless dark of Mirkwood. While Thranduil would lay the elven blade Orcrist upon Thorin's tomb, he would take back to the woodland realm the necklace of Girion, a great piece of jewelry adorned with emeralds, a gift from Bard. With the necromancer driven from Dol Guldur, Mirkwood has a brief respite. But like all Middle-earth, it would feel the effects as the War of the Ring draws near. Just 2 years after Bilbo's adventure, Gollum would travel through Mirkwood searching for this supposed thief. While he is not captured by the elves, his presence would haunt the woodmen, who whispered of a ghost that drank blood and would creep into windows to find cradles. Then, in 2951, just 10 years after he was driven from Dol Guldur, Sauron would send Khamul the Easterling, second greatest of the Nazgul, along with 2 other ringwraiths to reoccupy the old fortress. For decades, they would operate in the south as the elves remained in the north, seemingly at a stalemate as the shadow grows in Middle-earth. On March 21st, 3018, Thranduil would receive a visitor and a captive. Aragorn arrives having traveled 900 miles from the Dead Marshes with Gollum in tow. Along the way, he had been aided by the Beornings, the men of Mirkwood who had followed Beorn, and by this later time, his son, Grimbeorn. 2 days after Aragorn's arrival, Gandalf comes to Mirkwood and begins to interrogate Gollum for information about his ring and his actions. After a week in the Elven realm, Gandalf would leave, heading back to the Shire in order to send Frodo on his quest. Over the coming months, Thranduil's people would be charged with keeping Gollum prisoner. During his captivity, they would occasionally take him outside the Elven King's halls and allow him to climb trees. One day, 3 months after Gollum's arrival, orcs attack the Wood Elves, allowing Gollum to escape. Realizing others must be informed, Thranduil sends his son Legolas to Rivendell with the message. There he would take part in the Council of Elrond and join the Fellowship of the Ring. As this prince of the Woodland Realm embarks on the Great Quest, his homeland would come under a renewed threat from Dol Guldur. Our first clue actually comes from Frodo Baggins. When the Fellowship comes to Amon Hen, and Frodo sits upon the Seat of Seeing, he is able to see far across Middle-earth, and we are told, under the boughs of Mirkwood there was deadly strife of elves and men and fell beasts. The land of the Beornings was aflame, a cloud was over Moria, smoke rose on the borders of Lorien. While this is the only mention of such a conflict on February 26, 3019, there would be plenty more in the days to come. In 3 separate attacks on March 11th, 15th, and 22nd, orcs from Dol Guldur would cross the river Anduin and attack the realm of Lorien. Each time they are repelled by the elven warriors and the power of Galadriel and her ring. Coinciding with the second of these attacks is an attack on Thranduil's realm, also originating from Dol Guldur. This battle under the trees of Mirkwood would result in great fire damage to the forest. Yet in the end, Thranduil and his people would prove victorious. 6 days after the attack on the Woodland Realm, and 3 days after Sauron's downfall, Galadriel and Celeborn would launch an attack upon Dol Guldur. The Galathrim are successful, and this dark fortress, the greatest remnant of Sauron and Mirkwood, is thrown down by Galadriel's hand. 8 days later, on April 6, 3019, Thranduil and Celeborn would meet in the middle of Mirkwood. There they divide the Great Forest, now free of Sauron's influence. Celeborn takes the southern portion, making it East Lorien. Thranduil takes the portion north of the Emenduir. As for the central portion, it is given to the Beornings and Woodmen, who had for so long lived in friendship with them and also fought the forces of evil. To the forest as a whole, they would give a new name, reminiscent of its old one, Erin Las Galan, meaning Wood of Green Leaves. 20 years into the Fourth Age, Legolas would lead a group of elves out of his father's kingdom. By the leave of King Aragorn, they would set up a dwelling in the lands of Ithilien, making it the fairest country in all the Westlands. These elves were said to have lived in Ithilien for the next 100 years, and alongside dwarves led by Gimli, they would help restore Minas Tirith. As for Thranduil, we are told nothing of this elven king after his meeting with Celeborn. While some may envision him eventually taking one of the last ships into the west, it's also possible that he would live on in the Greenwood, ruling the Sylvan elves of the forest in his underground halls of the Woodland Realm until the utmost fading of their kind. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. CCDC Red Team, Evil Chameleon, Tom DeBombadil 19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Madame Director, Freya Firestar, Chris and Meg Q, Jason Cummings, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Kiara Berlin, Z and N, Evely, Kia, Landry Quinn Walker, Ice Glazer, Levi Olden, The Last Valorakar, and Kalasor, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.